such as the gene editing bill, rather than measures that dampen economic growth and depress living standards.
My honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right. The green technologies and innovations is what is going to help us achieve the net zero target. He makes reference to gene editing. I can also reference the recent CFD auction, which has delivered record renewables capacity in the country.
Mr. Speaker, well-insulated homes protect against extreme heat as well as extreme cold, while reducing energy demand, cutting bills, emissions and fossil fuel imports. So why are the government delaying their National Eco4 programme, with 50,000 households potentially missing out?
As I pointed out to her, there is a significant amount that the government is doing in terms of energy efficiency. Of course, we should always look to see what more that can be done.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend outline the discussions that he's had with his colleagues in government so as to act on the Climate Change Committee's recommendation of the need for further support, which is aligned to net zero, so as to help people with their energy bills?
President. Mr. Speaker, as he knows, support is being provided to help households, particularly the most vulnerable households will receive at least £200 worth of support. Of course, we also need to look at further energy efficiency measures, and I'm sure the new Prime Minister and Chancellor will look at all of this.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the court found that the government's net zero strategy was unlawful because it only included 95% of the emissions reductions required to meet the sixth carbon budget, and by not including the detail required to enable Parliament to properly scrutinise it. So what will the Minister do to rectify this, and which aspects of the strategy will he be strengthening now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said in response to an earlier question, the net zero strategy is not what has been quashed, and obviously the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy will look to respond on the judgment that's been made.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I commend my right honourable friend for his amazing service as COP26 President? And can I ask him to make it his objective to ban the sale of Chinese lanterns across the UK. Across our tinder-dry land, they are simply acting as unguided flamethrowers.
President, well,
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her kind comments. With regard to these lanterns, I will make sure this is raised with the appropriate department domestically.
The President showed great leadership at COP26, which we all respect him for. Can I ask him to do the same again and cut back on a project that's polluting both his and my constituents' lungs? Could he please revisit the biggest emitter of CO2 in the whole of Europe and think again about a new runway at Heathrow?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my role, as you know, as COP President, is to corral the international community. She's raised the question, and I'm sure the Department of Transport will respond.
Slade Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the dramatic increase in fuel prices presents opportunities for decarbonising fleets of vehicles in key sectors such as social care?
Well, it's very good. President.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point, and of course decarbonising the transport sector along with other sectors should be a key priority going forward.
Murray Gardner.
The recent carbon tracker report set out for each financial sector across the world its exposure to stranded assets, over $1 trillion in total. Will the COP President be engaging with each of the heads of the financial sectors like the Securities and Exchange Commission, the London Stock Exchange, to ensure that they cope with that problem?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the private sector is actually very focused on the issue of the move to net zero, and as you will know, in Glasgow, $130 trillion of assets signed up to net zero. Anyone investing in assets which might end up being stranded has to be very clear about the financial decisions they're taking.
Jerome Mayo.
Does my right honourable friend agree that establishing a price for carbon would give the free market the signal it needs to invest in low-carbon alternatives across the economy? Does he also agree that a carbon border adjustment mechanism is a necessary first step to achieve that?
Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend has raised this issue before, and of course tackling carbon leakage is a vital issue. As my honourable friend is aware, Her Majesty's Treasury will be launching a consultation later this year and setting out a range of carbon leakage mitigation options, which includes looking at a carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Boris Johnson.
Am I allowed to say to the Minister that many of us on these benches think he's done a darn good job? But will he make every effort, if he survives the present wranglings in the Conservative Party, will he come back and grassroot what we're trying to do about climate change in every community and every town and city and community? Let's have 500 sustainable towns and cities in this country. Does he agree with that?
Mr. Speaker, in the words of Gloria Gaynor, I will survive. But can I just say, Mr. Speaker, that the point he raises is that tackling the climate emergency is an issue for all of us, for governments, for civil society and individuals, and we all need to play our part.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I'd like to point out the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on the Parliament Live TV. I'd also like to welcome Lord Mackay, who is retiring today after many distinguished years as Lord Chancellor. Before I call Kim Leadbeater to ask the first question, it's only fitting. Before I call Kim Leadbeater, it's to ask her first question. It's only fitting to note this is likely to be the final time the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge addresses the House as Prime Minister. I would like to wish him and his family all the best for the future. Can I say, we've been through many dark times within this House, and none more so than through the pandemic, and always will be remembered for what this House did and the way that you conducted those duties during those dark times, Prime Minister. I understand that members will have differing views about the Prime Minister's performance and legacy, and those views will be sincerely and passionately held, but I remind members that our constituents and others around the world watch these proceedings. Let us conduct them in a respectful manner, focusing on issues and policies rather than personalities. I take this opportunity to remind members of the words of Erskine May. Good temper and moderation are the characteristics of the parliamentary debate. I expect to see that reflected today in the proceedings. I now call Kim Leadbeater.
Question number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks the 40th anniversary of the bombings in Hyde Park and Regent Park, and tomorrow sees the 50th anniversary of Bloody Friday. Such terror by the provisional IRA was barbaric and shameful, bringing untold grief to countless families, and our thoughts are with all those who lost loved ones during the Troubles. We as a government remain determined to help build a better shared future for all the people of Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to the Chair of the National Fire Council last night and this morning about the heroic work of firefighters in recent days. I know the whole House will want to thank them and all our frontline services who've been working hard to keep us safe. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, will be making an oral statement later. Mr. Speaker, I know colleagues will wish to join me in wishing England's Lionesses well in their quarter-final match against Spain in Brighton this evening. And I know that the House will want to congratulate Jake Whiteman, who produced a stunning run to take gold in the 1,500 metres at the World Championships in Oregon. Mr. Speaker, as you rightly say, last week I told the House that this was possibly, that last week was possibly my last PMQs. This week, Mr. Speaker, probably, certainly will be my last PMQs from this dispatch box, or any other dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I will have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Summer recess gives all parliamentarians an opportunity to reflect on our inability to uphold the 7 principles of public life. Selflessness, openness, objectivity, honesty, integrity, accountability and leadership. These are fine principles, but public trust in politicians is at an all-time low. Will the Prime Minister be using the next few weeks to personally consider why this could be? And as the unedifying fight for his job continues, if those who are vying to replace him were to draw on his wise counsel, if those who are vying to replace him would draw on his wise counsel, and why wouldn't they, what advice would he give to ensure the people we serve receive far better than they have from this government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I didn't quite catch the last bit of the honourable lady's question, but I will be using the next few weeks to do what I think the people of this country would expect, and that is drive forward the agenda on which we were elected in 2019, and for which I think the Labour Party particularly fear the Conservative Party, and that is the agenda. And that is the agenda of uniting and levelling up, and making sure that we invest in places that for decades were betrayed by Labour and left behind. And that is what the Conservatives are going to do, and that's why we're going to win again.
Luke Evans.
Russia's war in Ukraine continues. Now, Turkey have withdrawn its opposition to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. So what assessment does my right honourable friend make about the short and long-term securities of Europe now this has happened?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that excellent question. The accession of both countries, I think, will be good for them. I think it will encourage, it will make all our allies safer, and I think it will make the whole of the Euro-Atlantic security area stronger, Mr. Speaker. And I'm proud of the role that the UK has played in that accession.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I start by saying to the Prime Minister that I do know that the relationship between a Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition is never easy, and this one's proved no exception to the rule. But I would like to take this opportunity to wish him, his wife and his family the best for the future. Can I also put on record our gratitude to the fire and rescue services for all their courageous work yesterday in extreme temperatures. All our thoughts are with those affected by the fires, particularly those that have lost their homes. I join the Prime Minister in his comments about the bombings in Hyde Park and the IRA bombings. I also join him in his comments about the Lionesses. The coverage starts at 7:30 tonight on BBC One, and I'm sure the whole country will be roaring them on. And for anyone who doesn't fancy football, EastEnders is on. So if you'd rather watch outrageous characters taking lumps out of it themselves, you've got a choice: Albert Square or the Tory leadership debates on catch-up. On that topic, Mr. Speaker, why does the Prime Minister think that those vying to replace him decided to pull out of the Sky debate last night?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not following this thing particularly closely, but my impression is that there's been quite a lot of debate already, and I think the public are having an ample opportunity to view the talent, Mr. Speaker, that any one of which, as I say before, like some household detergent, would wipe the floor I mean, today happens to be just about the anniversary of the exit from lockdown last year. And do you remember what he said? He said, yeah, I'm going to remind him, he said it was reckless. It was because we were able to take that decision, Mr. Speaker, supported by every single one of those Conservative candidates, opposed by him, that we had the fastest economic growth in the G7. We're now able to help families up and down the country. If we'd listened to him, it wouldn't have been possible, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think they'll be listening to him either.
Well, I'm impressed he managed to get through that with a straight face, actually. I think the truth is this. They organised the TV debates because they thought it would be a great chance for the public to hear from the candidates first-hand. Yeah. Then disaster struck because the public actually heard from the candidates first-hand. But I am interested in what he makes of the battle for his job. So let me start with a simple one. Does the Prime Minister agree with his former Chancellor that plans put forward by the other candidates are, in his words, I've got them here, nothing more than the fantasy economics of unfunded spending promises?
Well, Mr. Speaker, they know all about fantasy economics because they've already committed to £94 billion of extra tax and spending, Mr. Speaker, which every household in this country would have to pay for, to the tune of about £2,100. It's thanks to the former Chancellor's management of the economy, thanks to this government's management of the economy, we had growth in May of 0.5%. We have more people in paid employment than at any time in the history of this country, Mr. Speaker. And I'm proud to be leaving office right now with unemployment at or near a 50-year low, Mr. Speaker. When they left office, it was at 8%. That's the difference between them and us.
Mr. Speaker, every Labour pledge made under my leadership is fully costed. Those vying to protect him, Mr. Speaker, those vying to replace him have racked up £330 billion of unfunded spending commitments. But I do note that the Prime Minister didn't agree with his former Chancellor. So what about his Foreign Secretary? She was withering about the government's economic record. She said, again, her words, here they are, if Rishi has got this great plan for growth, why haven't we seen it in the last 2.5 years at the Treasury? That's a fair question, is it, Prime Minister?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I think everybody would agree that what you saw in the last 2.5 years was because of the pandemic, the biggest fall in output for 300 years, which this government dealt with and coped with magnificently by distributing vaccines faster than any other European government, faster than any other major economy, which would not have been possible if we had listened to him. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we have the fiscal firepower that is necessary to help families up and down the country, making tax cuts for virtually everybody paying national insurance contributions. The difference between Labour and the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, there's a crucial philosophical difference. Under Labour, families on low incomes get most of their income from benefits. Under us, they get most of it from earnings, because we believe in jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the difference, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, inflation is up again this morning, and millions are struggling with the cost of living crisis. And he's decided to come down from his gold wallpapered bunker for one last time to tell us that everything's fine. I am going to miss the delusion. But his Foreign Secretary didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. She also said that the former Chancellor's 15 tax rises are leading the country into recession. And the member for Portsmouth North was even more scathing. She said, again her words, our public services are in a desperate state. We can't continue with what we've been doing because it clearly isn't working. Has the Prime Minister told her who's been running our public services for the last 12 years?
Mr. Speaker, this is absolute. Again, he's doing this completely satirical. This is the government. This is the government that is investing £650 billion in infrastructure, in skills, in technology. He talks about public services. What really matters to people in this country right now is getting their appointments, getting their operations, fixing the COVID backlogs. That's what we're doing. Fixing the ambulances. That's what he should be talking about, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we voted through. That's why we passed the £39 billion health and care levy, Mr. Speaker, which they opposed. Every time something needs to be done, Mr. Speaker, they try to oppose it. He's just a great pointless human bollard, Mr. Speaker. That's what he is.
Mr. Speaker, if only it was satirical. It's what the future candidates think of his... Mr. Speaker.
We want to get through PMQs because there's quite a few of you wanting to catch my eye. It would be more helpful if we get through in order to do that. Keir Starmer.
I appreciate they may not want to hear what their future leader thinks of their record in government, but I think the country needs to know. If only it were satirical, Prime Minister. It's what the candidates think of the record.
Yeah.
But among the mudslinging, there was one very important point, because the member for Saffron Walden claimed that she warned the former Chancellor that he was handing taxpayer money directly to fraudsters in COVID loans. She says he dismissed her worries and that as a result he cost the taxpayer £17 billion. Does the Prime Minister think that she's telling the truth?
Prime Minister.
Okay, well, this is one of the last blasts from Captain Hindsight, Mr. Speaker, because at least to me, because they were the party. I remember they were the party who were so desperate for us to be hiring their friends with PPE. They wanted a football agent to supply and a theatrical costumier to supply PPE. Do you remember, Mr. Speaker? We had to get that stuff at record speed. We produced £408 billion worth of support for families and for businesses up and down the country, Mr. Speaker, and the only reason we were able to do it at such speed is because we managed the economy in a sensible and moderate way. And Labour, every time they've left office, it's with unemployment higher, they're economically illiterate, Mr. Speaker, and they would wreck the economy.
I think the message coming out of this leadership contest is pretty clear. They got us into this mess, and they've no idea how to get us out of it. The Foreign Secretary says we can't go on with our current economic policy. The member for Portsmouth North bemoaned the fact that what we've been doing has not been good enough. And the member for Saffron Walden probably puts it best when she simply asked, why should the public trust us? We haven't exactly covered ourselves in glory. Their words, their future leaders' words. They've trashed every part of their record in government, from dental care and ambulance response times to the highest taxes in 70 years. What message does it send when the candidates to be Prime Minister can't find a single decent thing to say about him, about each other, or their record in government?
Mr. Speaker, what does it say? What does it say about him that no one can name a single policy after 3 years of the Labour opposition, apart from putting up taxes? He's one of those pointless plastic bollards you find around a deserted roadworks on a motorway, Mr. Speaker. We got Brexit done. He voted against it 48 times. We got this country fast out of COVID in spite of everything he would have kept, and when he would have kept us in lockdown. We're fixing social care, Mr. Speaker, when they have no plan and no ideas of their own. And we're now bringing forward measures in the face of strikes to outlaw wildcat strikes, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you to outlaw wildcat strikes. I can tell you why he does that funny wooden flapping gesture. I'll tell you why he does that funny wooden flapping gesture. Because, Mr. Speaker, he's got the union barons pulling his strings from beneath him. That's the truth. £100 million, Mr. Speaker. We've restored our democracy and our independence. We've got this country through COVID, and I'm proud to say that whether it comes to tackling climate change or sticking up for Ukraine, we have led the world on the international stage. And I want to thank my friends and colleagues on these benches for everything that they have done.
Mr. Speaker, in September it will be 25 years since the 25th anniversary of the referendum on devolution in both Scotland and Wales. 1 in 20 people in England and the NHS have been waiting for more than a year. In Wales, that's 1 in 5. And school leaders in Wales, 75% of whom say that they don't have enough capital to maintain their existing buildings, regardless of building any others. In his final opportunity at the dispatch box, will the Prime Minister and the Minister for the Union agree that in terms of Wales at least, devolution has been a disaster?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want devolution to work, but I think, and I've had some good conversations with Mark Drayford, but the devolved authorities, particularly Labour in Wales, need to do their job properly.
Now comes to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join you in wishing all the best in his impending retirement to James Mackay and Beth. He's been a friend to many of us right throughout this House, and we congratulate him for his service. Can I also join the Prime Minister in congratulating Jake Whiteman for his success overnight in winning the 1500 metres at the World Champions? What a fantastic achievement. Mr. Speaker, this week has seen historic records set across the United Kingdom. But let's look at the Prime Minister's record-breaking efforts in office. His Tory Brexit slashed £31 billion from the economy, the biggest fall in living standards since the 1970s. People's pay in real terms falling at the fastest rate on record, with the worst economic growth forecast in the G20 outside Russia, and the highest inflation in 40 years. Personally, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister in his capacity as Minister of the Union for driving support for independence to new heights. Mr. Speaker, Westminster is holding Scotland back. The economy is failing, and this Prime Minister has driven us to the brink of a recession. Isn't it the case that the Prime Minister's legacy of catastrophic mismanagement has paved the way for the end of the Union?
Mr. Speaker, that's not what I observed. And he talks about records. I'll point to the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, lowest unemployment, as I said, for at or near 50 years, the lowest youth unemployment, fastest growth in the G7 last year in spite of everything. As for the Scottish nationalist record, just look at where they are. I'm afraid to say Scottish school standards are not what they should be because of the failure of the SNP. They're failing people who are tragically addicted to drugs, Mr. Speaker, in Scotland. And the people of Scotland are facing another £900 million in tax because of the mismanagement of the SNP.
I mean, the Prime Minister might believe that nonsense, but the people of Scotland don't, because they know the reality that our NHS is the best performing in the United Kingdom, and education standards under the SNP are moving in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, that's a good look to the people of Scotland, the disdain that the Tories show for our country. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Prime Minister has time to reflect on his conduct in office with all his new spare time, and I genuinely hope that he finds some peace of mind. The fact is that as well as a record breaker, the Prime Minister is a rule breaker, illegally shutting down Parliament, partying through the pandemic, handing out PPE contracts to cronies, unilaterally changing the ministerial code. And let us not forget, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is still under investigation because he can't be trusted to tell the truth. Shameful, disgraceful, and a complete waste of Scotland's time. This is how the people of Scotland will remember this Prime Minister. Isn't it the case that the Prime Minister and his government should have had its last day a long time ago? Quite simply, Downing Street is no place for a lawbreaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, look, Mr. Speaker, I think on the points, the personal abuse stuff, I think he's talking a load of tosh. But when he's retired to his croft, which may be all too soon, Mr. Speaker, I hope that he will reflect on his long-running campaign to break up the greatest country in the world. And I hope he will reflect on the pointlessness of what he is trying to do and think instead about the priorities of the people of Scotland, which I think are about all the issues that he thought were trivial, about their education, about crime, Mr. Speaker, and about the burden of taxation that they are unnecessarily placing on the people of Scotland.
Welcome, Longy. A long time ago, when I trained as a pilot, I had the luxury of being able to fly around turbulent storms, but what I also had was the ability to rely on a team that kept my aircraft airworthy. As the Prime Minister prepares his new flight plans, could I suggest that he might reset his compass to true north and stops off in Dudley, where he will always be welcomed with open arms, with sincere affection, and where he will be able to see the legacy of what he
I thank him for that renewed invitation, Mr. Speaker. I've spent many happy days with him in Dudley, and let's hope that there are more to come.
And David!
As the Prime Minister leaves office, I'm sure the whole House is looking forward to him completing his book on Shakespeare. We wait to read what he really thinks about tragic figures brought down by their vaulting ambition, or scheming politicians who conspire to bring down a tyrannical leader. The candidates, Mr. Speaker, now plotting to take his place, all profess that they will bring a fresh start, a clean break from his government. But does the Prime Minister not agree with me that a fresh start and a clean break would require a new mandate from the British people? And before they strut and fret their hour upon the stage, there should be a general election.
Mr. Speaker, I think that Polonius, that's who he is. What you need, more matter with less art, Mr. Speaker. The only thing you need to know, if there were to be a general election, of course, the Liberal Democrats would rightly get thrashed, because that would be. That is the moment when the public actually look with horror at what Liberal Democrat policies really are, and all these rural voters would discover the massive green taxes that they would like to apply, and the only risk is that there could be some kind of crackpot coalition between those guys and the Lib Dems and the Scottish Nationalists to put that into effect. That is what we must prevent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents feel very let down by the Mayor of London. He is consulting on cutting 18% of London's buses. The Met is in special measures. He's looking to sell Notting Hill Police Station to the highest bidder, and he is looking to push through a completely unwanted overdevelopment of South Kensington Tube Station. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that Londoners deserve way, way better?
Mr. Speaker, London once had a mayor who cut crime by 25% and cut the murder rate by 30% and built twice as many affordable homes as the current incumbent, and what London needs is another Conservative mayor.
Jamie Stone. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I just add a personal note of thanks to Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who is retiring. He is a Highland gentleman, and he's been very, very helpful to me for a number of years, and I'm extremely grateful. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows that harnessing willpower, wind power, is crucial to the United Kingdom.
You're right.
The Prime Minister also knows that the Highlands have faced great historic difficulties over the years. So I hope that the Prime Minister agrees with me that a green freeport in the Cromarty Firth is vital to harnessing wind energy. It has the full support of the industry and vital to the prosperity of that region.
I thank you very much. I can confirm that we're committed to funding two new green free ports in Scotland to the tune of £52 million. Wouldn't be possible, of course, if the SNP got their way and we returned to the EU.
Jake Burry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my friend on his work to tackle regional inequality in this country through his levelling up agenda? And as he rightly reflects with pride this summer on the work of both himself and his government, will he also urge all candidates in this leadership election and all colleagues in this House to further drive forward that levelling up agenda to tackle inequality wherever it is found within this United Kingdom?
I heartily agree with my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, and it's not just my right honourable friend. It's not just inequality; it's inequality of opportunity, and that's what levelling up addresses.
Johnny Lloyd, sit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, very few people in the north of England believe that the levelling up agenda has achieved anything at all. Now, the Prime Minister has a few days left in office. Can he use this to drive through the Trans-Pennine rail system that we were promised would be finished in 2019 and will not be finished before 2030? It's a shambles and he is responsible.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, this government's responsible for 3 new high-speed lines, including Northern Powerhouse Rail, which no previous government has done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend rightly paid tribute to our hard-working firefighters dealing with the fires over the last few days in this unprecedented weather. Will my right honourable friend take action to make sure more fires can be prevented by getting rid of disposable barbecues and Chinese sky lanterns?
The ones that flow.
Right, I thank my honourable friend very much for her suggestions. I think the key thing is for people to behave responsibly first with the use of these things. It's clearly insane to take a disposable barbecue onto dry grass.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Due to Scottish Government investment in affordable housing, the Scottish child payment and extended free school meals, Scotland has the lowest level of child poverty in the UK, in contrast to the North East, which has risen by 50% on the watch of this government. In contrast, the Prime Minister took over £1,000 from the poorest families, so much for levelling up, and those fighting to replace him have been falling over themselves to promise tax cuts to the wealthy. So if the UK is meant to be a voluntary union, does he not recognise that voters in Scotland have the right to a referendum so they can choose a fairer future?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, we increased the living wage across the whole of the UK by £1,000. We made sure that people on universal credit got their tax bills cut by £1,000. And we've, in the last couple of weeks, we've cut national insurance contributions by an average of £330. And it was because of the union that we were able to support families up and down the country in Scotland with the furlough and other payments to the tune of £408 billion, Mr. Speaker.
Andrew Bowie.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for his commitment to Scotland and the entire United Kingdom over his years in Downing Street, and to him and my friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, for improving and increasing the visibility and involvement of the UK government in Scotland over the past 3 years. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that whoever takes his job and whatever comes next, the United Kingdom will always be stronger together than it ever would be apart?
Brilliantly put. I couldn't put it better myself.
Kate Osmond.
Mr. Speaker, the Windrush Compensation Scheme was launched in April 2019. In the time since, we've seen this Prime Minister come and go. Meanwhile, just 1 in 4 applicants have received compensation so far, and at least 28 have sadly passed away without receiving compensation. Isn't it about time for the government to make the scheme independent of the Home Office and finally provide justice to the victims before it is too late?
Malthouse.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I think more people have got compensation. I renew my apologies to the Windrush generation for what they've suffered. But we have greatly increased the compensation available. We've paid out, I think, more than £51 million. We're working with voluntary groups to ensure that people get what they're entitled to. But I may say that Labour has never apologised for their own part in the Windrush scandal.
Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for all of the work he has done for Scunthorpe, but can I pay particular thanks to him for the work that he has done for steel? He has shown his understanding both of the challenges that steel faces and of its importance to this nation. He has kept every promise he has made to me on steel, and I want to thank him very much for his work on that. Does he agree with me that the future of steel is always safest under a Conservative government?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I thank her for everything that she has done to champion UK steel, a vital national industry.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has been the very embodiment of the excess and the vice that the Ministerial Code was designed to protect. And once trust is broken, it's very hard to rebuild. The trust of the Good Friday Agreement between the peoples and between the governments of these islands has been systematically destroyed over the last 6 years, and people across the island of Ireland, whether unionist or nationalist or neither, have looked on in horror at the degradation of the rule of law, at the deterioration of Anglo-Irish relationships and at the bolstering of the far right. Many of us will work to try and restore those relationships and ensure the decent people of Britain and Ireland live entwined lives for many years to come. Can I ask the Prime Minister if he is capable of any self-reflection? Does he have any regrets of his legacy of damaging our fragile, shared society and all the people of Northern Ireland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I completely disagree with that. The whole objective of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill that we've passed is to support the Belfast Good Friday arrangements, to support the balance of those and symmetry of those arrangements. I was very pleased that it passed it got its advance into the House of Lords with no amendments, Mr. Speaker.
Crispin Blunt.
Mr. Speaker, in recalling the situation the Prime Minister inherited in July 2019 of a Parliament with a majority determined to frustrate the result of the 2016 referendum, led by a Speaker who was just slightly partial, and the seemingly impossible situation we found, does my right honourable friend understand that he has the gratitude of my constituents that can identify the wood from the trees and myself for his leadership over the last few years?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and there's a fair amount of wood on the opposite bench, and I think that's why we will prevail in the next general election.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2014, the Tory party have had more Prime Ministers than we've had referendums. May I remind the PM of the Smith Commission report? It states it is agreed by all parties that nothing in this report prevents Scotland becoming an independent country. Therefore, does the Prime Minister believe in a democracy, and will he respect the people of Scotland's right to self-determination?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the people of Scotland do not, frankly, want to be talking about constitutional issues when another referendum, when the issues before the country are the cost of living, the educational issues that we discussed, drugs, crime, Mr. Speaker. I think they're far more pressing.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister spoke earlier about the atrocities carried out by the IRA. For decades, many men and women had the courage to put on the Queen's uniform and uphold law and order in Northern Ireland on Operation Banner. One of the Prime Minister's undoubted achievements is he brought in the Northern Ireland Legacy Bill so that those people who serve their country can finally sleep safely in their beds. Thank you for that, Prime Minister, if I may be so presumptuous, on their behalf. You kept your word to them.
I'd like to thank my old friend for everything he did to campaign on that issue for so long. And I'm glad that this government was indeed able to fulfil its promise, not just to the veterans, but to their families as well. And I would like to renew my thanks to the security services who do so much to keep us safe, but also to all those who put on the Queen's uniform.
Molly Cowan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister, the OECD forecast the UK economy with zero growth in GDP for 2023. That will be the worst performance in the G7. Ireland, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Iceland, Sweden, Austria, Belgium and Finland are all wealthier than the UK. Why should Scotland not be afforded the same opportunity to seek prosperity through being a sovereign, independent nation, standing as an equal amongst other equal nations?
Mr. Speaker, the UK was the fastest in the G7 last year. We'll return to the top of the table soon because we came out of COVID fastest, and 0.5% growth in May, Mr. Speaker. And the people of Scotland, don't forget, the people of Scotland, like the people of the whole of the UK, are supported by the massive fiscal firepower of the UK Treasury, and that is a great advantage.
Sharon McCrory.
Mr. Speaker, and can I place on record my thanks particularly to the firefighters of Cornwall, who were also extremely busy and courageous yesterday. Can I thank this Prime Minister for his support and enthusiasm for Cornwall and for the people of Cornwall over the last few years, not least for the hosting of the G7 last year. And can I also thank him for the investment of the Shared Prosperity Fund, an investment of £132 million, which for an national average of £17 a head, Cornwall sees £233 a head. And does my right honourable friend agree that his enthusiasm for levelling up every part of the United Kingdom needs to carry on in the future?
Yes, she's a fantastic champion. My friend is a fantastic champion for Cornwall, and we will continue with our programme to support the Greater South West, whether it's through the A303 or broadband. Mr. Speaker, Cornwall has a bright future with her as a representative.
Justin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the Prime Minister has been on the Randan at Chequers, people in Scotland are suffering because of this Tory cost of living crisis, and we're paying a high price for his disastrous hard Brexit imposed against the wishes of Scottish voters. It's time to end this democracy denial, Prime Minister. Scotland can't afford to stay shackled to this crumbling union and Tory governments that we don't vote for. Does the Prime Minister not accept that Scotland is a democracy? He has no right to overrule the votes of people in Scotland, and we will have the referendum that we voted for.
Mr. Speaker, this is the country that secured furlough, that delivered the vaccine across the whole of the UK, while the SNP gets on with overtaxing to the tune of £900 million. Mr. Speaker, that's what they're overtaxing in Scotland, and we had a referendum, Mr. Speaker, in 2014.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that my right honourable friend is aware of how important the seafood processing industry is to the Grimsby-Cleethorpes area. However, there is one cloud on the horizon, and that is the recently imposed 35% tariff on white fish, which is causing industry leaders considerable concern. And though they recognise that it's important to maintain sanctions against Russia, this is causing, as I say, great concern. Would my right honourable friend arrange meetings with me and my honourable friend from Grimsby with the appropriate ministers so we can discuss measures how to mitigate the impact on the industry?
Minister. I'll make sure he gets a meeting as soon as possible with the relevant minister, but I think it is very important that we encourage our great fish and chips shops in Grimsby, Cleethorpes and elsewhere to make sure they're not just using Russian fish and chips.
John Littleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister limps off into the history books, his name up there in the pantheon of greats alongside the Duke of Portland and Spencer Perceval, can he update us on his defenestration honours list? How many of his cronies will he ennoble? Can we expect him to surpass Harold Wilson with a lavender list of dodgy donors, obsequious courtiers and pinchers by nature?
Very poor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that everybody who has served this government loyally and well deserves recognition of some kind. But as for the honours list, I'm afraid he'll have to contain his excitement.
Can I just say, we wanted good temper and better moderate language. And I don't think we got it then. Right, well, I know we didn't. Anna Firth.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his support for the new city of Southend. brilliant hospital turns 90 next Tuesday, but our heroic NHS staff are hampered by the size of the A&E department. Conservative-led capital funding of £8.4 million to expand the A&E department was promised 5 years ago, but has not quite arrived. Will my right honourable friend encourage the new Health Secretary to give us the best birthday present ever, and in the words of Cuba Gooding Jr., show me the money?
Order. I think the Prime Minister's got the message also. I'd like to hear your question as well.
She's absolutely brilliant champion for Essex and for her hospital. I know the case is under review by the department, but never forget it's only possible because of the money that this government is investing.
Go round, Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be remembered as a man of his word. Pile 'em high, 200,000 dead, the highest in Europe. F business. For this is the truth. They don't like it, do they? Let's listen to the truth. 400,000 fewer people in jobs than before the pandemic, if you include the self-employed, which the Prime Minister doesn't. So will he now keep faith to the 3.7 million people who've taken out student loans since this Conservative government was in power, who now face rising inflation in terms of rent, in terms of heating, in terms of eating, who now must pay Listen to that rabble. Listen to them.
Sit down a minute. When I stand, it's easy if you sit down. It helps all of the chairs. I want to get to the end of the question. I know it's going right to the end now. Go round, Davis.
The 3.7 million people who face 7% interest rates from September, as well as the inflation on heating and rent, when mortgages are 2%. Will he help those people in need, or will he help the city people who are making his friends making all this money out of the cost of living crisis?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what students want. They want to be able to have a system where they don't pay back more than they borrow, and that's what we're putting in. But they want to make sure also, Mr. Speaker, that they have a jobs market that will take them on with high-wage, high-skilled jobs. And the difference between them and us is that we get people into high-wage, high-skilled jobs. They're prepared to let them languish on the dole, Mr. Speaker. And that is the difference.
Final question, Sir Edward Lee.
On behalf of the House, may I thank the Prime Minister. On behalf of the House, may I thank the Prime Minister for his 3 years' record of service. On behalf of some of the most vulnerable people in the country, can I thank him for his insistence on rolling out the AstraZeneca jab, which has saved thousands of lives around the world. On behalf of 17.4 million people who voted Brexit, may I thank him for restoring people's belief in democracy. On behalf of northern towns, may I thank him for his commitment to levelling up. And most of all, on behalf of the people of Ukraine, may I thank him for holding high the torch of freedom and ensuring that that country is not a vassal state. For true grit and determination, keep going, and thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my right honourable friend, and I want to use the last few seconds, Mr. Speaker, to give some words of advice to my successor, whoever he or she may be. Number one, stay close to the Americans, stick up for the Ukrainians, stick up for freedom and democracy everywhere. Cut taxes and deregulate wherever you can to make this the greatest place to live and invest, which it is. I love the Treasury, but remember that if we'd always listened to the Treasury, we wouldn't have built the M25 or the Channel Tunnel. Focus on the road ahead. Focus on the road ahead, but always remember to check the rear-view mirror. And remember, above all, it's not Twitter that counts. It's the people that sent us here. And yes, the last few years have been the greatest privilege of my life. And it's true that I helped to get the biggest Tory majority for 40 years and a huge realignment in UK politics, Mr. Speaker. We've transformed our democracy and restored our national independence, as my right honourable friend says. I've helped to get this country through a pandemic and helped save another country from barbarism. And frankly, that's enough to be going on with. Mission largely accomplished. For now, I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all the wonderful staff of the House of Commons. I want to thank all my friends and colleagues. I want to thank my right honourable friend opposite, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank everybody here, and hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
We now come to the statements. I'm looking for Mr. Malthouse. He's here. How could I lose him? There you go. Now going to come to the statement on the heatwave response. I call the Secretary of State, Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on this week's heatwave. Coningsby in Lincolnshire broke records yesterday when it registered a provisional reading of 40.3 degrees Celsius. According to the Met Office, no fewer than 34 locations around the United Kingdom exceeded the country's previous highest temperature of 37.8 Celsius set in 2019. We have seen a collective national endeavour to prepare for and manage the effects of the heat, from Town Hall to Whitehall and across various industries to keep people safe and infrastructure functioning. From water companies and rail engineers to public servants right across the land, everyone has pulled together, with members of the public responding in a way that was responsible and took the pressure off vital public services. Our national resolve has been exemplified by our fire and rescue services, for many of whom yesterday was the busiest day since World War II. They were undoubtedly stretched but coped magnificently, and the systems put in place to make sure the fire service can operate on a national basis as well as locally worked well. In tinderbox conditions, they have dealt with dozens of wildfires around the country over the past 24 hours. 15 fire and rescue services declared major incidents and handled emergency calls the length and breadth of the country. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, at least 41 properties have been destroyed in London, 14 in Norfolk, 5 in Lincolnshire and smaller numbers elsewhere. On behalf of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and I'm sure the whole House, I'd like to pass on our sincere condolences to those who have lost their homes or business premises. And I know my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, is working closely with local authorities to provide support to them. Throughout recent days, the Prime Minister has monitored our work and has been specifically briefed on a number of occasions. We did so again this morning. The Prime Minister was briefed during the wildfires by Mark Hardingham, Chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Civil Contingency Secretariat, and he has also passed on his thanks to all the brave firefighters who sought to control the flames in such debilitating conditions. I would also, Mr. Speaker, like to pay my tribute to the fire control staff, officers and support teams for their essential work, and the other agencies that have made such tremendous efforts in recent days, the NHS, our emergency call handlers, Police and Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, amongst many others. Honourable members will be relieved to know that some pressure on these services will now ease as the fiercest heat has subsided. Many incidents are now being scaled back. Thunderstorms are likely this afternoon, but for much of the country, more clement, dry conditions are the pattern in coming days. The Met Office, however, stresses that the summer is likely to bring further hot weather and wildfire risk remains elevated. That is why we're treating this heatwave as an exacting test of our national resilience and contingency planning. As always, Mr. Speaker, there is no room for complacency. We have seen over the last few days what you can achieve when you prepare properly and then work closely together. Owing to the technical expertise of the weather forecasters who predicted with admirable precision the peak of the heatwave and how high the temperatures would be, the government was able to launch an advanced campaign of comprehensive public advice. And our early data shows how, well before the heatwave arrived, people were taking on board this advice from the UK Health Security Agency, the NHS, the Chief and Deputy Medical Chief Officer, emergency services and key agencies on the ground. And because of our established local networks and colleagues in the devolved administrations, we had people spread across the UK ready to step in when it matters. I am particularly grateful, Mr. Speaker, for the cooperation and support we receive from the Scottish Government, Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Executive. We all need to manage these events together. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give some examples of how people taking the right action help to mitigate the effects of the extreme weather, starting with heeding advice. Fully 5 times as many people accessed NHS England internet pages on how to manage the symptoms of heat exhaustion in the critical week beginning July the 11th. That's 5 times as many. Moving on to our vital 999 call services, we had feared that they would come under untold pressure, yet as the mercury climbed inexorably on July the 18th, fewer 999 calls were made than the week before, and more 111 calls, again suggesting that the public had heeded the advice, this time to avoid 999 unless in emergencies. And on to travel, Mr. Speaker, and once again people were playing for the team. The public stayed at home to avoid the heat, not venturing far. The data bears this out. On Monday, footfall at major London stations was around 35% of normal post-pandemic levels. Yesterday, Network Rail reports passenger train numbers were around 40% down on the previous week. We did not forget those who cannot easily leave their homes either, asking people to look out for the elderly and vulnerable family members and neighbours. Tragically, however, Mr. Speaker, 13 people are believed to have lost their lives after getting into difficulty in rivers, reservoirs and lakes while swimming in recent days. 7 of them, sadly, teenage boys. And I would like to pass on our sincere condolences and that of the whole House to the families of the victims for their terrible loss. Of course, we still have to work through the longer-term consequences of the heatwave. The true picture will not come until all incidents are analysed, all emergency teams are debriefed and all incident logs and data reconciled. There is a great deal of data yet to come in from colleagues in the devolved administrations and from the local authorities and agencies around the country. We do recognise, Mr. Speaker, that we are likely to experience more of these incidents and that we should not underestimate their speed, scope and severity. Britain may be unaccustomed to such high temperatures, but the UK, along with our European neighbours, must learn to live with extreme events such as these. The government has been at the forefront of the international efforts to reach net zero, but the impacts of climate change are with us now. This is why we have a national adaptation programme under the leadership of the Environment Department. As we have seen in recent days, we will continue to face acute events driven by climate change. It is the responsibility of the Cabinet Office Ministers to coordinate work across government when these events take place. The government will continue to build our collective resilience. To this end, the National Resilience Strategy, about which I was asked on Monday, will be launched at the earliest possible opportunity by the incoming administration. In the meantime, I will continue to coordinate the work of teams across government in building resilience to make sure the country is ready to meet the challenges of the autumn, the winter and beyond. And it is in that spirit that I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The events of the last few days have been incredibly traumatic for communities across Britain. Individuals and families have had their homes destroyed, and as the Minister says, lives have been lost. And as a mother of teenagers, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate they must not swim in our rivers. It is too dangerous for them to do that. Farmers and businesses have also seen their livelihoods go up in smoke. We saw horrifying images of the A2 on fire yesterday, and I want to join the Minister in paying tribute to the incredible bravery of our fire services and those whose job it is to head straight into danger as the rest of us escape it. Sadly, 4 firefighters have been hospitalised in South Yorkshire and over a dozen injured in London. I know the whole House will give them our gratitude and wish them well. But for too long, Mr Speaker, our public servants have been underappreciated and undervalued by this government. The Minister mentioned our fire services. Over the last 10 years, the funding and staffing of the fire and rescue service has been cut and response times have gone up by 8%. Yesterday, no mutual aid was available to services facing literal firestorms. Mr Speaker, this statement today is far too late. The impact of this heatwave was completely predictable. Why the delay in coming to this House? It has literally taken the country to go up in flames for the Minister to turn his focus on this emergency. Climate change, Mr Speaker, will cause more and more national emergencies like this, from heat waves to fires, floods and pandemics. But as we've seen over the past week, the leadership contenders are doing their hardest to outbid each other on how they would cut action on climate change. They will leave us vulnerable to more freak natural disasters. The caretaker minister opposite says it's his job to chair Cobra meetings, but it should be the job of the Prime Minister to lead. Yesterday, the remaining cabinet gave the Prime Minister the complete volumes of Sir Winston Churchill as a leaving gift. But he is no Churchill, Mr Speaker. He has been missing in action. And can the Minister tell us where he was as the country burned? Where was he when Cobra was called last weekend? Has the Prime Minister attended any talks with ministers or senior officials in the days since? Isn't it the truth that the Prime Minister and his entire government have gone missing while Britain burns? We might have cooler temperatures today, Mr Speaker, but another heat wave is inevitable as our climate heats up. Britain cannot continue to be so unprepared. He tells people to drink water and wear a hat. It's just not good enough. We need a long-term emergency resilience plan for the future. So can the Minister say, where is the plan for delivery of essential services? How will people be kept safe at work, on transport, in hospitals and in our care homes? Where is the guidance for safe indoor working temperatures? He now says the government's National Resilience Plan will be published in due course by the new administration. It's already 10 months overdue, Mr Speaker. Why should the British people be forced to wait a whole year? It is the primary duty of any government to keep the public safe, and Britain deserves much better than this. Labour already has a resilience plan for the long term. We would implement a department-wide approach and appoint a Minister for Resilience. We would give local government the resources they need to plan and prepare for emergencies. And I'd just like to say that local government has been on the front line, and I pay tribute to their response to this crisis and what they did during the pandemic. But their resilience, Mr Speaker, has been eroded by 12 years of cuts and austerity at the hands of this government. And finally, Mr Speaker, Labour would empower businesses and civil society organisations to strengthen our response. Homes have been destroyed, our brave firefighters hospitalised, and lives have been ruined and lost. Enough is enough. If he's not willing to take the action, Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House are.
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, what a shame that notwithstanding the loss of some homes and obviously some tragic deaths in water-related incidents, the Honourable Lady didn't take the opportunity to recognise that, by and large, the system worked, that the planning we put in place and the resilience that we built into all those public services and public servants, frankly, that she lauded, actually meant that the country got through this particular extreme weather event in pretty good shape. We obviously recognise that there were some unfortunate incidents and, as I say, a number of homes that were set on fire. But the fact that we kept the damage to a minimum, that the vast majority of the population got through this difficulty well, was not recognised by her at all, and I think that's a real shame. Secondly, just to correct something that she claimed when she said there was no mutual aid available. This is not correct. There was one fire and rescue service that called for national mutual aid, which was Norfolk, and mutual aid was provided from other parts of the country. So the system we have in place for flexing the use of the fire service across the whole of the country worked extremely well, as the chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council was able to confirm to the Prime Minister last night and indeed this morning. Now, the Honourable Lady seemed to claim that this was the first time I've turned up to the House. It's not. It's the second time I've been into the House to discuss this issue, and we've been working on this since the weather forecasters gave us notification that this extreme weather event was likely to occur. It is, however, Mr. Speaker, the first time the Honourable Lady has turned up to the House. Well, you were doing a radio station. Well, being in your office is not being on the front bench. Present but not involved, I think, is the claim from the Labour Party. So before she starts flinging stones, maybe she should polish the glass in her house before she claims that others are not doing their job. And as to the involvement of the Prime Minister, he's been kept in touch with our work throughout, either through personal briefings by me or indeed last night, this morning, briefings by the Chief Officer of the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Civil Contingencies Secretariat. She, I'm afraid, will never know, because I hope she's never in government. Number 10 and the Cabinet Office work very closely together when these emergency situations arise and where we need to put in place plans and specific coordination work to make sure that we all understand what the picture is. As far as the resilience plan, as I said, the plan is in progress and will be launched as soon as we get a new administration into number 10. But she should not mistake the publication of a national resilience plan for us not having any plans at all. And as we saw, Mr. Speaker, in all manner of areas of the function in our country, the plans that we have in place worked well. The capacity that we stood up flexed brilliantly often to deal with this ever-changing situation. And as I say, most of the country got through it in good shape. And as for the appointment of a Minister of Resilience, well, I'm afraid we already have one. It's me. The job of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is to look after the Civil Contingency Secretariat, which is to deal specifically with issues of resilience and make sure the system works, as it did largely yesterday.
James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, wildfires in northwest Norfolk destroyed properties in Brancaster Staithe and also destroyed habitats and wildlife at the famous Wild Ken Hill estate that's well known from hosting the BBC Springwatch. So, can I put on record my constituents' immense thanks to the Norfolk Fire Service and the other emergency services, as well as all those in the local community who helped to tackle these blazes in such awful circumstances, and they will recover and rebuild those communities. And in doing so, will he also reinforce our commitment to achieve net zero so that we are better protected from this climate change?
Well, the Honourable gentleman is quite right that Norfolk Fire and Refuse Service was severely tested yesterday and indeed did receive mutual aid, I think, from as far afield as Merseyside to help them in that battle. And they will stay, I understand, in situ to make sure that the Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service can kind of get back on its feet and deal with anything that may come in the next few days. And while we are very focused on the continuing elevated risk of wildfires, he is quite right that the long-term work for us both to make our own contribution to the battle against climate change, but frankly to lead the world and challenge some of the biggest polluters in the world to change their habits and their uses of fuel is absolutely critical. And I know that in Parliaments to come, he will be in the forefront of that fight.
Brendan O'Hara, the SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I thank the Minister for prior sight of his statement. And let me begin by paying tribute to all of the emergency services who have once again gone above and beyond to help their fellow citizens in this time of crisis. And may I extend our sympathy also to those people whose homes and businesses have been destroyed by the fires that raged across parts of England. Mr. Speaker, we may not have known anything like this before, with record temperatures being set in 3 of the 4 nations of the UK, and with a symbolic 40-degree barrier being broken in England, but sadly, I predict that something like this is here to stay, and we're all going to have to live with it, and governments are going to have to prepare for it in the future. Mr. Speaker, climate scientists have been warning us for decades that this day was coming, and it would be disingenuous in the extreme for anyone to claim that this was a one-off freak event or even dare compare it to the summer of 1976. This is the climate emergency. This is exactly what we were told would happen if we didn't change our ways. Exactly. This is what COP26 was all about. And that's why those who are still part of this Tory leadership race cannot, must not, renege on their commitment to achieving net zero in return for securing votes from the party's base. So could the Minister tell me, where is the plan to increase and bolster resilience so that the government response in the future the guaranteed future heat waves is more coordinated and strategic than we've witnessed. And with melting roads, buckling rail tracks and dissolving runways, what plans are being considered to make our critical infrastructure more resilient to this type of heat? And finally, does he agree with me, and I suspect the majority of the country, that the optics of the Prime Minister deciding to party while parts of the UK literally burned showed a complete unawareness of lack of self-awareness and a complete dereliction of duty?
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I join, first of all, the honourable gentleman in celebrating our firefighters? It is a really remarkable form of public service to run towards an inferno in all circumstances, and particularly wildfires, which I know can be very challenging for firefighters to address, not least because they often cover a much wider area, say, than a house fire. And it was particularly difficult, as I understand it, yesterday, because, of course, the ambient temperature was very high. Firefighters have to wear very heavy clothing and equipment, so it's particularly debilitating physically upon them. So he is right to celebrate them. I'm sure he is aware that as far as building resilience into our infrastructure, we do have a national adaptation plan. And as we go through periods like this particular heat wave, we need to learn the lessons and adjust that plan accordingly. So, for example, there's been much debate over the last 24 hours about the impact on the rail system and what tolerances we build our railways to. Now, that obviously has a wide impact on the system. We need to learn from our European partners, because while you might stress your railway to deal with high temperatures, that stressing may not accommodate, for example, in Scotland, some of the very low temperatures which are achieved, and having uniformity across the country is completely critical. And as to attending the Cobra, I would just gently point out to the honourable gentleman that the First Minister of Scotland didn't attend either, and we had very happily the Deputy First Minister, or indeed other Cabinet members that joined, and they were able to function perfectly well in Cobra, as I'm sure she would have done.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I associate myself with the comments made by all honourable members who paid tribute to the emergency services who tackled these challenges fearlessly. In particular, the fire at Wennington, which generated a smoke cloud which spread across the whole of East London and Thurrock, which shows just how challenging it was. But I'd particularly like to draw my honourable friend's attention to the River Thames. He mentioned drowning incidents. And it has been challenging for the Port of London Authority for many years to actually encourage local authorities to do their bit to tackle drowning prevention. One, by raising awareness of just how dangerous the River Thames is as a waterway, and two, by making sure that there is sufficient safety equipment. Would he take this opportunity to perhaps remind them to work collaboratively with the PLA to actually address this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do think one of the lessons that comes out of this for all of us, not least, of course, in Scotland, where the schools are not sitting at the moment, where term has finished, is to underline to people who live or want to use bodies of water the dangers that are inherent in them. The Honourable Lady is quite right that the Thames may look like an innocent retreat from the heat, but beneath the waves there are strong currents which can, and we often see people get into difficulty therein. She raises a good point about the Port of London Authority, and I will take that away, if I may, and see what more we can do to coordinate between them and the riparian authorities.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The men and women of the Fire and Rescue Service were quite simply awe-inspiring yesterday, like they regularly are. But, you know, they cannot continue to work miracles, Minister. The impact of 12 years of cuts and austerity on the Fire and Rescue Service has been an absolute disaster, and it quite simply needs much more critical investment if we're to tackle climate change correctly. The morale within the Fire and Rescue Service is at an all-time low, and this week the government offered the members of the Fire and Rescue Service a paltry 2% pay increase. Absolutely outrageous to offer men and women who the Minister overseas was running towards the inferno yesterday. 2%. Minister, it's time we stop clapping the great members of Fire and Rescue Service and start paying them.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman I'm sure knows, pay is not of firefighters is not within the control of the government and is set by a body that involves both employees and the employers, many of whom are Labour-controlled local authorities. So while he may have strong views about the percentage that's been offered to the firefighters, this is a challenge that he has to put down to some of his own colleagues, not to the government. As he knows, the fire service has been remarkably successful over the last decade or so, or longer, in driving down the absolute number of fires with which they have to deal. Much of that is about their prevention work, which has been brilliant, but also about technology changes, not least in furniture composition. I'm sure he is also aware that there is a white paper out at the moment on fire reform, and I hope that he will make a useful contribution to it.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and thank him and his department, the cross-government working in the planning and resilience in these unprecedented weather times. Can I thank our emergency services, people in the public services, the NHS in the front line, in fire and rescue, police and our local authorities, our transport networks and people at large, our community volunteers. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to those people in Cumbria and right across the UK for all that they have done and continue to do to keep people safe?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a very welcome question from the honourable gentleman, and I'm, of course, more than happy to join him in thanking all those people who, as I say, played on the team to get us through in such good shape. There were obviously some tragedies, but the fact that we were able to minimise the number was a tribute to the work of all the organisations that he mentioned. And while I'm answering, could I also take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to my staff in the Civil Contingency Secretariat, who have worked round the clock over the last few days, and in particular closely with the Met Office as we sought to predict and prepare the country, coordinating across Whitehall and indeed all those other agencies. It's been a really remarkable effort, and as I say, notwithstanding the terrible tragedies that we have seen, the fact that we got through in good shape was down to all of their work.
Dame Nana Johnson.
The first opportunity I've had to congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman on his new role, and we shall miss scrutinising him on the Home Affairs Select Committee. Can I also add my thanks to the emergency services for everything they did yesterday to save property and lives. And as the Minister has already said, there is a white paper out about the Fire and Rescue Service, which has a deadline on its consultation on the 26th of July, which I think is Sunday. And I just wonder, in light of the fact that the Home Affairs Select Committee will be looking at this in the autumn, whether it would also be sensible to extend that deadline, because what we do know is that the events of this week show that there's clear evidence of climate change-driven volatility, which will have serious implications for fire and rescue services, and it may be a good time to reflect on that before submitting to the consultation. So if it could be extended, that would be helpful.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I certainly enjoyed being constructively challenged by her in my 3 years in the policing job. I hope I made a small difference to the safety of the public during those years, but obviously that will be for others to judge. Obviously, the timing of the white paper is not within my remit, but I undertake the Honourable Lady to raise it with the Minister concerned and make the point that she's made.
Where are we at now?
Sammy Wilson.
Sammy Wilson. Ms. Christie.
First of all, can I also congratulate the emergency services on the excellent work which they did. But is it not a fact, Minister, that whilst we have been pursuing the policy of decarbonisation, spending huge amounts of money on that, £50 billion to the energy industry in the last 20 years, another £50 billion estimated by the OBR in the next 3 years, with little effect on our own climate or the world's climate. We can wave our puny fists at the forces of nature, but the fact of the matter is it's not working. Would we not be far better, instead of spending money on expensive attempts to decarbonise, to spend that money on adapting to the inevitable changes in our climate to make people safe when we have either extreme flooding or extreme heat?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the honourable gentleman would agree that we should do both. That we should both adapt, and we have a national adaptation strategy. But I would urge him to be more optimistic about the impact that human ingenuity can have on solving the world's problems. We have seen throughout our history that the invention of technology in this country, once established and proven to work, often accelerates progress in other parts of the world. Whether that is the invention of the spinning jenny or the loom, or, for example, the invention of the silicon chip and indeed the smartphone. It is, Mr. Speaker, less than 15 years ago that the iPhone was invented. And in that just over a decade, pretty much the whole world has one. These things often start slow, but once they accelerate, they make a huge impact.
Boris Johnson. It was Bobby Seale that first titled his campaigning book, Seize the Time. And can I ask the Minister to seize this time and this opportunity? Many of us have been campaigning on climate change and global warming for a long time. The really pivotal moment was when I read Professor Steve Jones' Here Comes the Sun, I think 4 years ago, and reviewed it. But the truth is, campaigners, and we're all campaigners at this place, you suddenly know some particular incident is going to change the public mood and the public mind in terms of the urgency, priority, and dramatic need for action. Will he please say to his ministers, the future ministers and future Prime Minister, that this is the time to capture the imagination and really get the public behind it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is correct that incidents like these often seek to underline the importance of our mission our collective mission on climate change. And I, as somebody who's campaigned, I guess, and been an enthusiast for the hydrogen economy for over 20 years now, I'm always keen to welcome more people to the cause. But in truth, as we've seen in debates elsewhere over the last couple of weeks, we have to take care that as we seek to progress and fight climate change, we bring the population with us, and that we illustrate to them that the work we are doing not only will make their lives better, but critically that of their children, rather than being characterised sometimes as purely a cost today.
Mr. Njali.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm interested in what the Minister says about taking the public with us. Surely in this past few days, the public have been well aware of the impact of climate change and see the heat wave not just here in the United Kingdom but the 5 heat waves that are taking place across Europe as a consequence of inaction, of being too slow to react to climate change. And while I hear what the Minister says, I'm concerned about the contradiction between what we're hearing here today and what we hear about climate change and action to combat it from his party's leadership election. So can the Minister assure us that there is a commitment in government to continue to fight towards net zero as quickly as possible?
Mr. Speaker, the battle against climate change has been a central part of Conservative policy since the heady days of David Cameron, who campaigned on a slogan of Vote Blue, Go Green.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An illegal net zero strategy, no national resilience strategy, 15 areas declaring major incidents, 11,500 firefighters cut since 2010, and a 2% pay offer on the table. Don't the front line of the climate emergency deserve better?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, that's a question which the Honourable Lady needs to pose to her colleagues in local government, many of whom are of the same party as her, as she knows perfectly well. The pay awards to firefighters, as the Minister here knows perfectly well, the pay awards to firefighters are not within the control of the government and are settled by a body that includes both employers and employees.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay tribute to South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, who are doing amazing work yesterday under very difficult conditions to keep communities in my part of the world safe. The Minister, I'm sure, will be aware that the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy is conducting a timely inquiry into critical national infrastructure and climate adaptation. Can I ask the Minister what plans he has to follow suit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as we deal with these incidents, both in the last few days, but over a summer where obviously the forecasters are telling us the risk remains elevated, we will learn exactly the lessons that he is asking us to learn, and obviously we'll review the report that he produces. He will know, I'm sure, that we pay constant attention to the resilience of our critical national infrastructure, but as the climate changes, so should we.
Rachel Musk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I too commend the work of our NHS staff and North Yorkshire Fire Service, which currently is facing cuts, and I really urge that those cuts do not go ahead. But, Mr. Speaker, having dealt with a lot of flooding, I know what a resilience plan looks like. And yesterday, there just was not a resilience plan. There were no checks on the most vulnerable people in our community. There were no restrooms for a cool space for people that do not have such facilities. So can the Cabinet Secretary go back and instruct all resilience areas to put in place a proper integrated resilience plan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State at the Department for Housing, Levelling Up and Communities, was in close touch with the resilience forums and indeed, I think, attended their chairs meeting earlier this week. These are very good challenges and questions for her local resilience forum, and I'd be quite happy for her to arrange for her to meet the lead body on that resilience forum in her area in York, so that she can reassure ourselves that they have the right plans in place.
Margaret Furry.
I'd like to thank the Minister for his statement. Yesterday was the busiest day for London firefighters since the Second World War, and I would like to express my thanks to them for keeping us all safe, firefighters across the UK. I would also like to express my deepest condolences to the families of those that have died in recent days after getting into difficulties in the water. What support are ministers giving to organisations like the RNLI on campaigns such as Respect the Water to raise awareness of the dangers of open water swimming on hot days?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I obviously echo the Honourable Lady's thanks to the Fire Service, and I know all of us, specifically the Fire Minister on the front bench here, have been watching in awe as firefighters did their job over the last 48 hours. There has been a strong communication campaign in coordination with the devolved administrations, not least in Scotland, of course, where the schools are not open at the moment, to illustrate the dangers of young people specifically, but generally all of us, diving or jumping into water about which we know very little. One of the lessons that's come out of the last couple of days, Mr. Speaker, is possibly our need to target that communications more, and we will make sure that as we review what's happened over the last 3 or 4 days, this is one of the key things that we examine.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, it's always a pleasure to hear the Minister, and thank him for his statement. Also thank all of the Fire and Rescue Service for their endeavours, for their vital and important work that they do across all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Can the Minister outline if any discussions have taken place with the Ministry of Defence, for instance, to use our armed forces personnel to police lakes, rivers, etc., as we see the heatwave pushing people to unsafe areas to swim? As the Minister referred to, 13 people are believed to have lost their lives over the last period of time, and also add my condolences to all of those families who grieve empty chair in their house, so I think of all those as well. Does the Minister believe government can increase public safety to prevent further tragic loss of life, such as we have seen over the last few days? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we obviously, in the contemplation of any civil contingency situation, examine whether we have the capacity that we need to deal with it, and therefore whether we can seek it elsewhere. And I'm sure the Right Honourable Gentleman will remember, frankly, the worst picture that we saw in wildfires in the north of England in 2018, when Saddleworth Moor, White Hill, very large, extensive fires, when the armed forces were deployed to assist the emergency services. It wasn't deemed appropriate in this occasion, and in fact our judgment proved to be correct, that the emergency services would cope. As far as his challenge on whether we could do more to educate people, or indeed to target harden, if you like, bodies of water which proved to be dangerous, as I said to the Honourable Lady, that's definitely something which I think we'll need to take away and consider. I mean, obviously we would urge parents in particular to take responsibility and understand where their children are going to be, and warn them about some of the dangers, as we did with some of the health messaging about looking after elderly neighbours. We all have to work together to keep our young people in particular safe, but we will examine what more we can do as we learn the lessons from this incident.
Right, that ends that statement. We're now going to come to the next statement. I'll just let people leave the chamber. Look at some. Thanks. Right, we come to the next statement. The Secretary of State for Health, Women's Health Strategy for England. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement about the Women's Health Strategy for England. I know that many honourable and right honourable members will agree that for too long, women's health has been hampered by fragmented services and women being ignored when they raise concerns about their pain. On too many occasions, we have heard of failures in patient safety because women raising concerns felt they had not been heard. For example, the Ockenden Review into the tragic failings of maternity care and the independent inquiry into the convicted surgeon Ian Patterson. Indeed, in my role as a constituency MP, I also remember the outstanding work of my constituent Kath Sampson and her Sling the Mesh campaign, where once again the response was too slow when women raised issues about their care. We are embarking on an important mission to improve how the health and care system listens to women's voices and to boost health outcomes for women and girls from adolescence all the way through to later life. This isn't just important for women and girls, it's important for everyone, and this work is already well underway. Last month, we announced the appointment of Professor Dame Leslie Regan, one of the country's foremost experts on women's health, as the first ever Women's Health Ambassador for England. On top of this, we're investing an extra £127 million in the NHS maternity workforce and neonatal care over the next year. And we are creating a network of family hubs in local authorities in England. Today, Mr. Speaker, we're announcing the next step. We're publishing the first ever Women's Health Strategy for England, setting out a wide range of commitments to improve the health of women and girls everywhere. I wanted to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the almost 100,000 women who took the time to share their stories with us, as painful as it may have been. Your voices have been heard and were vital in shaping this strategy. And I'd like to set out the key components to the House this afternoon. First, we are putting in place a range of measures to ensure women are better listened to in the NHS. Indeed, 84% of respondents to our call for evidence recounted instances where they were not listened to by healthcare professionals. And we need to do more to tackle the disappointment and disillusionment that many women feel. We're working with NHS England to embed shared decision-making, where patients are given greater involvement in decisions relating to their care, including when it comes to women's health. Second, Mr. Speaker, we want to see better access to services for all women and girls. Women and girls have told us that the fragmented commissioning and delivery of health services can impact their ability to access them. This means that they have to make multiple appointments to get the care they need, adding to the NHS backlog. There are better ways to deliver women's health through centres of excellence in the forms of women's health hubs, designed specifically to holistically assess women's health issues, and where specialist practitioners can be more attuned to concerns being raised. We are encouraging the expansion of these hubs, and indeed this morning I visited Homerton University Hospital to see the benefits these local one-stop clinics bring, enabling women to have all of their health needs met in one place. Third, Mr. Speaker, it is essential that we address the lack of research into women's health conditions and improve the representation of women's data in all types of research. Currently, not enough is known about conditions that only affect women, as well as how conditions that affect both men and women impact them in different ways. The strategy sets out how we will tackle the women's health data gap to make sure health data is broken down by sex by default. Fourth, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will provide better information on education on issues relating to women's health. Our call for evidence showed that fewer than 1 in 10 respondents feel they have enough information on conditions in areas such as the menopause, and that many people wanted trusted and accessible information about women's health. The NHS website is currently a trusted source of health information for many people, and we will transform the Women's Health Contact to improve its existing pages, and indeed add new pages on conditions that are not currently there. But we also know that the NHS will not be everyone's first port of call for health information, and so we will expand our health partnerships, like the partnership between YouTube and NHS Digital, who are working together to make sure that credible, clinically safe information appears prominently for UK audiences. It's also important that medical professionals have the best understanding of women's health. And I'm pleased that the General Medical Council will be introducing specific assessments on women's health for medical students, including on the menopause and on gynecology. Fifth, our strategy sets out how we will support women at work. In the call for evidence, only 1 in 3 respondents felt comfortable talking about health issues in their workplace. And we also know that 1 in 4 women have considered leaving their job as a result of the menopause. So we will be focusing our Health and Wellbeing Fund over the next 3 years on projects to support women's wellbeing in the workplace. And we will be encouraging businesses across the country to take up best practice, like the Menopause Workforce Pledge that was recently signed by the NHS and the civil service. Sixth, we will place an intense focus on the disparities in women's health. We know that although women in the UK on average live longer than men, they spend a significantly greater proportion of their lives in ill health and disability when compared with men. But even amongst women, there are marked disparities. And our strategy shows our plan to give targeted support to the groups who face barriers accessing the care they need, for example, disabled women and women experiencing homelessness. It also shows how we are putting an extra £10 million of funding towards 25 new mobile breast screening units that will target areas and communities with the greatest challenges around uptake and coverage. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, as well as these cross-cutting priorities, the response to our call for evidence also highlighted a number of specific areas where targeted action is needed. These include fertility care, where we will be removing barriers that restrict access that are not health-based, but based, for example, on whether someone has had a child from a previous relationship, and make access to fertility services much more transparent. Another of our priority areas is to improve care for women and their partners who experience the tragedy of pregnancy loss. At the moment, although parents whose babies are stillborn must legally register the stillbirth, if a pregnancy ends before 24 weeks gestation, there is no formal process for parents to legally register their baby, which I know can be distressing for many bereaved parents. So we will be accepting the interim update to the Independent Pregnancy Loss Review and introducing a voluntary scheme to allow parents who have experienced a loss before 24 weeks of pregnancy to record and receive a certificate to provide recognition of their tragic loss. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a significant programme of work, but we cannot achieve the scale of change that we need through central government alone. We must work across all areas of health and care. We will need the NHS, the local authority commissioners, to expand the use of women's health hubs, the medical schools, regulators and royal colleges to help us improve education and training for healthcare professionals, the National Institute for Health and Care Research to help make breakthroughs that will drive our future work, and many others to play their part too. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to finish by thanking everyone involved in the development of this important strategy, including the Minister of State for Health, who is on the front bench with me today, for her determination that she has shown in taking this strategy forward. I'd also like to pay tribute to my predecessors, the Honourable Members, Right Honourable Members for West Suffolk and Bromsgrove. I know my right honourable friend is in his place, for their commitment to this important issue, even during the pressures of the pandemic. This is a landmark strategy that lays the foundation for change and helps us to tackle the injustices that have persisted for too long. I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I begin by thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement and add my thanks to the Minister for her work, his predecessor, the former Secretary of State who sat opposite, and of course officials in the department for the work that they have done. I'm genuinely glad that this work is out of the door when so much else has been in hiatus because of the wider political change afoot in government. And can I also join him in recognising the campaigning efforts of his constituent, Kath Sampson, as well as the efforts of my honourable friend, the member for Swansea East, who's campaigned tirelessly to raise awareness of the menopause and has been a driving force for change on behalf of women everywhere. For too long, Madam Deputy Speaker, women's health has been an afterthought, and the voices of women have been at best ignored and at worst silenced. 4 out of 5 women who responded to the government survey could remember a time when they didn't feel listened to by a healthcare professional, and that has simply got to change. In recent years, we've seen a string of healthcare scandals primarily affecting women. Nearly 2,000 reported cases of avoidable harm and death in maternity services at Shrewsbury and Telford. More than 1,000 women operated on unnecessarily by the rogue breast surgeon Ian Patterson. Thousands given faulty PIP breast implants, and many left with traumatic complications after vaginal mesh surgery. Meanwhile, every woman who needs to use the NHS today faces record-high waiting times. The NHS is losing midwives faster than it can recruit them. Gynecology waiting lists have grown faster than any other medical speciality. The number of women having cervical screening is falling, and black women are 40% more likely to experience a miscarriage than white women. This is the cost for women of 12 years of Conservative mismanagement. And so I want to address each part of the strategy in turn. The strategy promises new research, which is, of course, important. Studies suggest that gender biases in clinical trials are contributing to worse health outcomes for women. There is evidence that the impact of women-specific health conditions, such as heavy menstrual bleeding, endometriosis, pregnancy-related issues, and the menopause, is overlooked. So, of course, what the Secretary of State has said today about improving data is so important. But can he also set out how exactly the government intends to make use of this new data to improve outcomes for women? Improving the education and training of health professionals is absolutely essential, because when they don't, there are consequences. Almost 1 in 10 women have to see their GP 10 times before they can get proper help and advice about the menopause. And half of medical schools aren't teaching doctors about menopause when it affects every woman. So can I, alongside the proposal that the Secretary of State's outlined for training incoming medical students and incoming doctors, challenge him to go further? Because what plans does the government have for clinicians who are already practising? We need to upskill the existing workforce, not just the incoming workforce. And let's be clear, informing clinicians is no good if we don't also improve access to HRT. So where is the action in this strategy to end the postcode lottery for treatment we currently have? Turning to breast cancer, it's the most common type of cancer in the UK, and the NHS offers regular breast cancer screening to women aged between 50 and 70, which can prevent avoidable deaths by identifying cancer early when it is more treatable and survival is more likely. Yet fewer women in the most deprived areas receive regular breast screening than those in the most affluent areas. Even before the pandemic, too many women with suspected breast cancer were waiting more than the recommended 2 weeks to be seen by a specialist. So can the Secretary of State tell me how the programme announced today is going to make a difference to outcomes for patients if, once diagnosed, they just end up on a waiting list that's far too long and can't access the treatment they need? I do welcome what the Secretary of State has said about removing barriers to IVF for women in same-sex couples, which we welcome. For far too long, they've faced unnecessary obstacles to accessing IVF for no other reason than the fact they love another woman, and it's high time we put this right. And I do also want to mention endometriosis. Tens of thousands of women provided testimony to the government about the issues they face surrounding diagnosis and treatment. So can the Secretary of State give the House assurances that every woman who is treated for this disease will have equal access to specialist services for day one, and to make sure women don't have to fight to get the diagnosis in the first place? And on polycystic ovary syndrome, Madam Deputy Speaker, what is the Secretary of State going to do to make sure that we equalise access to a range of treatments, not least for women for whom the pill is simply inappropriate, to make sure we end the division between those who receive a prescription on the NHS and those who go privately receiving better treatment? I also want to raise some points about what hasn't been mentioned today. As well as the appalling figures on black maternity deaths, a quarter of black women surveyed by five more times felt that they received a poor or very poor standard of care during pregnancy, labour and their postnatal care too. Women who live in deprived areas are more likely to suffer a stillbirth than their richer counterpart. My honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, has pledged a new Race Equality Act to tackle the structural inequalities in our society, including healthcare. But we have a government that's more interested in stoking culture wars than acknowledging these inequalities even exist. Surely that has got to change with new leadership in the party opposite. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reality that faces women in this country is this. Breast cancer waiting times are through the floor. 500,000 women are waiting for gynaecology treatment. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth, and too many still can't get HRT when they need it. This strategy simply will not solve the depth of the crisis in women's healthcare after 12 years of Conservative mismanagement. And every day this Conservative government remains in office is another day where women will have to wait far too long for the care they desperately need.
Sajid Javid. Oh, I beg your pardon. I think it's probably a good idea if I allow the Secretary of State to answer the Shadow Secretary of State. I'm too many steps ahead. Secretary of State.
I didn't want Madam Deputy Speaker on the front bench thinking that their points had not been addressed. And I think actually there's much common ground across the House on the importance of this strategy and the need for a culture and system change within the NHS to address many of the concerns that have been reflected in past debates in this House on issues such as Mess or Patterson or Ockenden. And I think there's a lot of areas where colleagues across the House will work together in terms of how we encourage commissioners in our constituencies to reshape services in a way that better reflect the needs of this strategy. He's right to highlight that many respondents felt they have not been heard in the past. That's in particular why we've taken the first step of appointing a Women's Health Ambassador, Professor Dame Leslie Regan, an extremely respected figure in women's health, to better champion that, and why I also signalled in my statement the importance of data and the importance of sex by default data in order to better target our research on those conditions that impact women in a way differently to men, or are conditions that only affect women and are often not as well researched as they should be. So again, I think there's some common ground across the House on the issue of research. I agree with him on the point in terms of the need to improve training for existing clinicians as well as those new to the profession, and that's why again I signalled in my statement our desire to work with the Royal Colleges and others in terms of making sure that that continual professional development is there. He raised the issue of access to HRT. He'll be aware that we have put in place from April next year the prepayment certificate, so that someone will only pay the equivalent of 2 prescription charges in terms of HRT supply, and considerable work has been done by officials within the Department of Health on the supply chain issues to improve some of the difficulties that were there in the past. On the point that he raises on outcomes for patients, a good illustration of that can be seen in what I was looking at this morning at Homerton in terms of redesigning services which avoid the need for invasive and more expensive theatre treatment because of the use of new equipment that actually is allows better service to the patient. And indeed, if you look at the comments in the strategy from Professor Dame Leslie Regan, she makes the point that the irony is that services could be delivered which are far better for the patient but also cheaper to the taxpayer if we embrace the Women's Hub model of the sort that we see in Homerton, and I very much look forward to taking that data forward in terms of the conversations with other areas, other commissioners around the country. I'm pleased he recognised and welcomed the removal of barriers for IVF. I think all of us have seen the challenges of that in our constituency, cases that are raised, and I think that is a very welcome step and one shared across the House. In terms of the speed of service, then the Community Diagnostics Centre obviously have an important role to play there. He raised the issue of ethnic minorities, and we have put in place a maternity disparity task force. Ministerial colleagues have already met, I think, 3 times as far as that task force is concerned. So the characterisation that ministers are not engaging on this issue, I'm afraid, is wide of the mark. He also mentioned breast cancer. And again, he will have noted from my statement that an additional £10 million of funding is going in, targeted specifically, Madam Deputy Speaker, at that issue, with a further 25 mobile units, which again is about addressing this issue of disparity in health, women's health data, if one looks at different parts of the country. But overall, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an important strategy. It's one that reflects a very large number of responses to the consultation. We have listened to those voices. That is reflected in the strategy set out, and I think it is an area on which there's much common ground across the House.
And now I'll call Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I mean, there was a time I would follow right after the Shadow Secretary of State. Not anymore, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I'm very pleased to follow my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. And can I take this opportunity to welcome him into his new role? He has the privilege of running a fantastic department. He is so important to the British people. He's excelled in every role he's held in government so far. I know he will do so again. Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome strongly the Women's Health Strategy today, as we heard the very first published by any government, and congratulate also everyone that's been involved in that, all the officials especially, but especially also the excellent Minister, my honourable friend, the Minister of State, sitting on the Treasury bench, and also the previous Health Minister, now my right honourable friend, the member for Mid-Bedfordshire. Can I ask my right honourable friend, does he agree with me that when it comes to women's health, that early diagnosis is absolutely essential, and that in doing our very best, whilst I absolutely welcome the commitment that's in the strategy today about mandatory training on women's health issues for new doctors, could he also just say a little bit more about what can be done around existing doctors and clinicians and training for them as well?
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First, can I just say the work on this strategy was done before, obviously, I arrived in the department. It was down to my right honourable friend and the Minister of State, and it's great to have the opportunity to pay tribute to him for all he did to drive this agenda forward. He's absolutely right in terms of the importance of training, the importance of early diagnosis. That is why I think addressing the issue of fragmented services is so important. It's also why ensuring that where women raise concerns, as the respondents said, they often felt like a lone voice in the wind, was, I think, one of the phrases that really resonated with me in the strategy. And so having hubs, having centres of excellence, having the ability to look at that data and identify it early, alongside the other initiatives that he played a key role in as Secretary of State, such as the diagnostic hubs, are all a key part of the delivery of this strategy.
Carolyn Harris.
Deputy Speaker. I rise to specifically speak on the menopause services included in the strategy, and as co-chair of the Government Menopause Task Force, I broadly welcome the strategy, but I do feel it does fall short in some places. Whilst better menopause training for doctors of the future is essential, there is not much in there about upskilling GPs or prescriber medics such as pharmacists or women's health nurses now. With only 14% of women accessing HRT and menopause care through medical lack of awareness in diagnosing and prescribing, training medical professions of the future does nothing for women today. With 50% of women not even discussing their symptoms, we need a public awareness campaign. Outside of the campaign being run by the media and by grassroots and celebrity activists, to ensure that all women get the memo, as it were. A commitment to a national formulary for HRT, to end the postcode lottery in quality, quantity and availability of body-identical hormone replacement therapy. I emphasise body-identical. And as for HRT costs, well, I'm delighted that my private members' bill that I negotiated with the government last October now appears as part of the strategy. But I'm bitterly disappointed that the time frame for that once annual charge is delayed until April 23, 18 months after it was promised, demonstrating to me a lack of urgency in dealing with women's health issues that affects 51% of the population. And whilst we're talking about delays and women not being listened to, I'm still waiting on responses to 6 letters to either this Secretary of State or his predecessor, dating back to May the 5th, asking to discuss all the issues that I've raised today. So I would be grateful to have a meeting to discuss these further. Thank you, Madam Deputy.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady says she isn't being listened to, but my understanding is she's co-chair of the Menopause Task Force, which has been set up to look at these issues. Indeed, she has also had meetings with officials to discuss HRT. So I think it's slightly remiss when Department of Health officials are meeting with her and we have a task force underway to suggest that she's not being listened to. But I think the point she raises, again, I think there's much consensus. I think she has highlighted quite rightly the importance of HRT. We have acted on that. Part of the reason that it is not until April is because the IT systems need to be put in place. And when I was a Treasury Minister, I recall very well, on the one hand, being asked in response to COVID to move at pace because of the cash flow pressures on businesses, and then sometimes the same colleagues complaining that fraud controls and other issues have been put in place. So we need to put the right IT in place. We will do that for April, but that work is doing. So the issues she's raised have been addressed, but we're doing it in an effective way. On the issue of training, as I said to the Shadow Secretary of State, I agree, and we will work with the Royal Colleges to address that. I think it's a perfectly fair point, and I don't think there's disagreement within the House. On the wider issue of addressing disparities, that is exactly what the task force is about. That is why we have such a relentless focus on data. It's why we've got a Women's Health Ambassador to give greater voice to these issues, and it's why we brought forward specific measures, such as the family hubs, such as the mobile breast screening unit, in order to better address those disparities.
Maria Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and its recognition of the need to have specific strategies to make sure that women have equal access to services. But it's silent on one of the biggest healthcare injustices that women face in our country, that abortion is still treated under Victorian criminal law, with the most draconian laws in the world. 17 women in the last 8 years have been subject to criminal investigation, including simply because they suffered the appalling issue of stillbirth. This strategy should stop this by expanding the government's own change in the law in Northern Ireland to make sure that abortion is an issue between women and their doctors, and that every woman is protected from criminal investigation at a time when what they need from us is care and compassion.
My right honourable friend is right that there is a need for care and compassion, and she highlights an extremely important point. She will be aware, I'm sure, that we have the sexual health review that is currently being conducted. That will report later this year, and that will look into the issue that she raises.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask the Minister how this strategy will address the postcode lottery associated with gynaecological wait times?
Well, again, it's partly by having an ambassador that will be tasked with advocating in that space. It's having the data to give visibility to that. But it is also about working in partnership with commissioning groups, with the NHS, and also with the Royal Colleges in terms of training, to give much greater focus to these issues.
Teresa Villiers.
Can I thank the government for bringing forward this strategy? It really is astonishing that it's the first government ever to have produced such a strategy. And will he use this to drive forward improvements in care for endometriosis? and in particular the updating of the NICE guidelines NG73 to make sure people have earlier diagnosis and better access to pain relief for this debilitating condition which too many doctors do not have a high enough awareness of.
I think looking at the consultation responses, this was one of the absolute key issues that came out. And indeed, in my conversation with Dr. Watson this morning at Homerton, looking at different pathways for treatment that avoids the need for theatre on that. And key to that actually is some of the innovation on pain management that clinicians are looking forward, and how we then, through NICE, socialise that innovation across the NHS.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The North East has some of the highest levels of health inequality in the country. North East women spend over a quarter of their lives in not good or poor health, which is almost 3 percentage points above the national average. So would the Secretary of State set out how he plans to, the steps he plans to take to target those areas which already have high levels of inequality? And does he agree that when he talks about research, and I very much welcome the additional research that needs to be done, that should also target areas with high levels of existing inequality, which is unfortunately not the case at the moment?
We are already doing so, Madam Deputy Speaker, on things like the Centrified Family Hubs that we have put in place. And again, a key part of this strategy is to then look at having women's hubs, particularly in those areas where there is greatest disparity.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome my right honourable friend to his place, and also the appointment of Dame Leslie Regan as the Women's Health Ambassador. And I think between the two of them, I know them both to be very passionate and outcome focused, and I hope we'll make some headway. He talked quite rightly about the fact that women don't feel listened to. And we know that women go for many years suffering from very common gynecological conditions that don't get diagnosed. So what role does he think that more public health education about healthy menstruation and what constitutes a healthy period can go to actually make sure that women are more empowered to look after themselves and get treatment earlier?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend's warm welcome, and I absolutely agree with her about empowering patients, empowering women in terms of information themselves, and that's why, for example, a part of the strategy is to focus on the NHS website and the information that is provided in that, but also to work with trusted partners to look at where people go for their health information and how we can better empower them. So, for example, in the consultation, patients being told that heavy bleeding was normal, that was something they had to accept, was again one of the issues that was highlighted in respondents to the call for evidence that we made. And it's making sure people realise where there are issues and their voice is heard, which is really at the heart of the strategy that my honourable friend has set out.
Hannah Bardell.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I am delighted to see the UK Government follow in the footsteps of the Scottish Government with a women's health plan. I'm also very pleased to see that they have taken on board the campaign from Stonewall to bring the rest of the UK into line with Scotland in terms of same-sex couples, female same-sex couples and access to IVF, because for far too long it has been a postcode lottery and lesbians have been discriminated against. But as a co-chair, along with my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull of the all-party group on endometriosis, I'm pleased to see the recommendations of more research and better care for those who suffer from endometriosis. But can we be absolutely certain that it will be backed up by proper support and funding? Women's healthcare champions are fantastic, but they cannot replace proper funding and a proper strategy. And I also, Madam Deputy Speaker, just want to pay tribute to the work of Sir David Amos. I have no doubt that this strategy and the endometriosis aspects of it wouldn't be there without the great work that he did in his chair of the all-party group on endometriosis.
Well, firstly, can I thank her in particular for that tribute to the work Sir David contributed to this, and also agree with her on the issue in terms of same-sex couples having access to IVF. She's right in terms of better research and how we highlight that. That is a key part of the strategy. But it is also interesting from the comments of the Health Ambassador that actually services can be reconfigured in a way that give a better outcome to the patient that does not lead to higher cost. By having centres of excellence where the women's voice is heard, then treatment comes quicker, and actually that delivers better patient outcomes.
Alex Sharp.
Speaker, and may I welcome my right honourable friend to his place and say how good it is that he's had direct experience with Kath Sampson, Sling the Mesh and that work there. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for Livingston and the Honourable Lady for Hull Western Hessel, who have worked very closely, all the three of us, cross-party, in bringing these issues to the floor in Westminster Hall debates in this chamber, which I think has played a big part of being in today's strategy, and thank across the House for that work's being done. May I ask my right honourable friend, within the strategy we talk about centres of excellence and mesh centres, but they have to be carefully monitored, because we are getting a lot of feedback now that mesh centres aren't working in the way that we perhaps think they are. That's something that's going to be carefully monitored. Also, data collection is perhaps not working the way that the Minister would hope it would be working, so that's going to have to be important. And I really welcome the strategy about listening to women. You know, anecdotally, too often the words sexist and misogynist have been used about the attitude of the NHS towards women, and we need to move to a stage where those words are no longer used, and that it's not go and take some painkillers and pat you on the head and it's all very normal. And just on that final point, I think it's important if my right honourable friend could talk to our right honourable friend in the Department for Education about actually teaching at school of diseases like endometriosis, because if you don't know a disease exists, how do you know you've got it? And that's a really important point. But overall, I really welcome this strategy by my friend. It's a massive step forward, but we all need to recognise that we can't give up. There's a lot more to do and make sure that what's in this actually works.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, who I know has campaigned for many years and particularly worked on mesh as a particular issue that he and I have spoken about in the past. In respect of data and the quality of data, I'm very happy to work with him on any specific examples to ensure, and indeed colleagues across the House, because I know there's others that have worked very closely on the mesh campaign, as to how we get the consistency of data right and how we get the right analysis of that, because I think that is a shared interest of all in the House today. In terms of DFE, I'm very happy to take that forward with my right honourable friend in terms of looking at what schools can do to raise awareness, and I think it ties in with the wider point, which is ensuring that patients have the right information and that where issues of concerns arise, they're not fobbed off, but they're taken seriously.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's certainly been times, including now, where it's been very difficult for me to talk about my experience of miscarriage. An experience that is shared by 1 in 5 women, 1 in 4 pregnancies. Last year I held a debate and I got the government to agree to support some of the measures in the Lancet review on miscarriage, named Miscarriage Matters. Now, the Royal College of Obs and Gynae have adopted the 3 miscarriage rule and abandoning that and supporting a stepped response and graded model of care. But I want to know, are the other things that were promised at the end of that debate in this strategy, that is access for everyone for 24/7-hour care, data so that went and recording on medical records of miscarriage. So like what happened to me when I was called for my flu jab, the nurse didn't go, when I asked, why have I been called for my flu jab? She'd go, because you're pregnant, look down and then say, oh, well, you're not, are you? And also, stopping the need for unnecessary miscarriages by making the care better, because actually you can prevent miscarriage in some cases, even when it's beginning. You can stop people having multiple miscarriages and having to live with this pain, increase their risk of suicide. And we could do so much more. Miscarriages are taboo, and too often it's put in the too hard to deal with box. So a certificate, yeah, would be lovely, but it's not enough for adequate care that rapidly reduces people having to go through this trauma again and again and again. Yeah.
Well, I think the heart of the whole House goes to the Honourable Lady, and because of the trauma that is so visible with these experiences, and I'm hugely grateful for the powerful way that she highlights them to the House. She'll be aware that we do have the pregnancy loss review that is reporting later this year, and we'll be looking at the very important issues that she raises. I know she met recently with my honourable friend, the Minister of State, to discuss the issues in the debate, and certainly as someone new to post, I will be looking very closely at the points she raises.
Flick Drummond. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady, because I know exactly what she's feeling, and this is the place really to make a difference. So, every encouragement to keep going. This is an extremely good strategy and will make a difference to women. And can I thank the Secretary of State for recognising that domestic violence has a dramatic impact on women's health, women who are reluctant or embarrassed to go to their GP. And can you make sure that there's more training in primary care settings to recognise and help these vulnerable women?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right on the importance of tackling domestic abuse. Indeed, that is why the House last year passed, the government brought forward and the House passed the legislation on the Domestic Abuse Act in recognition of that. And I think there's an important read across from issues of domestic abuse also into the wider piece on data and how that in turn links into prosecutions, into evidence gathering and into empowering those who are victims with the support they need. It's an extremely important issue and it's important that we take that legislation forward.
Mohammed Yasin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that midwife and maternity services are struggling across the country. We have seen in my own constituency that Bedford Hospital, despite their best efforts, have struggled with midwife recruitment and retention. So what steps are the government actively taking as part of their women's health strategy to ensure that maternity services are well staffed and resourced?
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst this strategy today sets out a number of things in the future, there are a number of steps we have already taken, including on maternity services. So he will be aware we've announced an extra £127 million of support for the NHS maternity workforce, 95 million to recruit an additional 1,200 midwives and 100 consultant obstetricians. So steps have been taken and more steps are set out in the strategy.
Dame Caroline Diamond.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As one of the former health ministers who carried the baton on this strategy for some time, I just very, very warmly welcome my right honourable friend's words today and his commitment to this. It's so important, not least the commitment to address some of the fertility inequalities across the country. I met with his predecessor because my constituency is one of those areas most severely affected by this postcode inequity. As he says, there are some real health inequalities, not just for women, but between women in terms of the services that are provided, and in particular for reaching those women that are vulnerable and most hard to reach. It isn't just about money, it's also about, which is why I'm pleased about his commitment to hubs, but it's also about making sure that ICSs have a focus on place and have a focus on the needs of local community. So I'd love him to just commit a little bit more to that. One other thing, since 2015, there's reportedly been a 42% real terms fall in contraception spending. And so I would also like to have his commitment that this document will align with the Sexual and Reproductive Health Action Plan. This is really important because for every £1 spent on these services, we save £9 on other public health spending.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, firstly, I'm very grateful for the work that she did as a health minister in championing this agenda. And she's right to highlight the issue of contraception. Often the difficulty of access to that is very much at the heart of the responses we had on the fragmented service that many women experienced. She will be aware that a key part of our approach is with the health and wellbeing funds and working with the voluntary and community sector on support, for example, on areas such as pregnancy loss. But a key part of this and the visibility of the women's health strategy, putting that at the fore in terms of a women's health ambassador, is as part of the conversations, as she says, with the integrated care systems to ensure that this gets greater prioritisation within the commissioning. And a key part of securing that is to have the data to demonstrate both the importance of it and the benefits of doing so.
Munira Wilson.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also start by paying tribute to the Honourable Lady from Sheffield Hallam for her very powerful and moving personal testimony. My constituent Nicola last year experienced her 7th miscarriage, which was her 3rd in just 12 months. We know that 1 in 100 women suffer recurrent miscarriage, often without known cause and without an effective treatment for it, and a disproportionate number of these are from our Black, Asian and other ethnic minority women. So I very much welcome his commitment and his comments today to boost research in this area. But I'm afraid we haven't heard any specifics in terms of how much. Now, last year, the NIHR only spent 5% of its budget on reproductive health and childbirth, yet these issues affect some 17% of the population. So could he give the House an indication of how much more he's going to spend on research in this area?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, firstly, through the tragic case that she highlights with Nicola, she demonstrates very effectively why research in this area is so important, and the fact that there has been insufficient research in the past. In terms of the amount of funding, to a large extent that is shaped by the research proposals that come forward, and a key part of the strategy is the clear signal that we are sending to the research community that those proposals are being encouraged. And so it's very much an encouragement for those willing to do research in these areas that have not had the focus in the past. A key part of the strategy is to encourage those proposals so that funding can be prioritised to them.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And as chair of the all-party parliamentary group on endometriosis with my honourable friend from Livingston, and joint chair on the vaginal mesh with my honourable friend from Elmet and Rothwell, I welcome the strategy. But if I may, I'd just like to raise two quick issues with the Minister. One is we would be really keen to see all of the recommendations of the Cumberledge Review implemented, including the redress for the people impacted by vaginal mesh. And secondly, it was really good to hear him talking about recognising how women's health affects women in the workplace. But there is also Endometriosis UK, the charity, are promoting making workplaces endometriosis friendly, recognising that women who have endometriosis may be having to have shorter periods of time off more regularly. And this is, in terms of HR policies, frowned upon and looked on badly, resulting in some women losing their jobs for no fault of their own. So be really keen if you could have a look at that specific policy around endometriosis friendly employees and following all of the recommendations of the Cumberledge Review.
Well, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, from my own involvement in the MESH campaign, just how central her role was to that, and I pay tribute to the work that she has done on that and a number of other campaigns over recent years. In respect of MESH, you'll be aware there is an annual review published, and that is following up on the first point she raises. On the second one, in terms of workforce, I think a key issue that comes out of the report is the importance of the workforce, the workplace, the time off work that many women are experiencing, the difficulty quite often in having those conversations with employers. I think it's very welcome that the civil service has taken a lead, as has the NHS, in certain aspects of that, but clearly there will be more to do, and the point she raises will be part of that wider conversation.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the appointment of the Women's Health Ambassador, Dame Leslie Reagan? I think that's an excellent appointment. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sexual and Reproductive Health's 2020 report on access to contraception found that the current fragmented commissioning arrangements had a severe impact on women's access to contraception and a lack of joined-up services. Now, with 45% of pregnancies in England being unplanned, can the Minister, the Secretary of State, just say what specific plans he has to remove the barriers to co-commissioning of reproductive health care, to require different parts of the system to work together to meet women's healthcare needs?
Well, firstly, can I welcome her acknowledgement of the expertise that Professor Dame Leslie Reagan brings to her role. I think she will be fantastic in that role as ambassador. On the issue of the fragmented health system and how that impacts on areas such as contraception, that is a key part of this strategy. That is why we're having things like the Women's Health Hubs to provide that one-stop shop and that centre of expertise in order that we can better identify the services that people need.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Black women are 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth. So can the Secretary of State explain what targeted preventative solutions the Maternity Disparities Task Force will apply to address this totally unacceptable position?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're working through the recommendations of that task force, and we will publish that shortly. And part of the reason the task force was set up is because of the disparity in data, and clearly that is something we need to address.
Ruth Cadbury. Madam Deputy Speaker, I really welcome this women's strategy and hope that it will mean better care for women, whether it's gynecological and reproductive issues, breast cancer and so on. But it needs to go further. Too often, Madam Deputy Speaker, women experiencing severe levels of pain are sent away from their GP with painkillers and too often find out down the line, sometimes too late, that they were actually experiencing a real health problem, whether it's lupus or cancer or one of any number of health conditions. So, and this is backed up by a 2021 study that showed that men and women expressing the same levels of pain are not treated equally by clinicians. So, will the Secretary of State ensure that, and the Minister, ensure that the focus on clinical training and retraining also addresses gender stereotyping in diagnosis and support as well? Thank you.
Well, part of the reason this is a 10-year strategy is because it does need a change of culture as well as a change of systems, and that is what the strategy maps out. And a key component of that is how we empower the patient, so areas such as the NHS website, working with trusted partners who provide health information. But she's also right in terms of training, and we touched on that earlier in the debate, not just for those who are new entrants into the medical profession, but for existing clinicians, and that is something that we'll be working with the Royal Colleges and others to drive forward.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
The strongest legs in this chamber. Can I welcome very much the Secretary of State's announcement of additional monies for women's health training. And I want to perhaps give an example. I want to refer to the Secretary of State's second recommendation, where he refers to one-stop clinics. Having spoken to a medical student who just coincidentally graduated in Cardiff today, she outlined that she feels that more is needed for the speciality of women's health, and specifically the menopause that honourably referred to earlier on. So can the Secretary of State outline what training will be extended to GPs in, as a suggestion, the one-stop clinic, to ensure that each surgery has a trained GP available to advise and to help? Thank you so much.
It is one of the key areas that was highlighted in the respondents to the call for evidence, was how areas such as the menopause were being dealt with by the NHS. That is why we've got the menopause task force looking at specific recommendations, and one of those areas that the task force is looking at is the training of clinicians.
Thank you. I thank the Secretary of State, everyone who took part in the statement. We will now proceed. Point of order, Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wanted to draw the Deputy Speaker's attention to the fact that the Member for Spelthorne and Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has, at just a couple of hours' notice, today notified the Environmental Audit Select Committee that both he and his officials are withdrawing from today's critically important evidence session on North Sea oil and gas transition, which is due to start at 3:20 this afternoon. This was done without explanation or apology. Does the Deputy Speaker agree that in doing so, this is showing an extreme discourteous to the House and a complete disregard for scrutiny?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order and for having given me notice of her intention to make it. I'm most concerned about the point that the Honourable Lady raises. It is indeed, as she suggests, a discourtesy to the committee and therefore to the House for a senior minister to withdraw from an advertised session to give evidence on an important matter. Mr. Speaker has repeatedly said that it's extremely important that ministers give evidence to committees in a timely way. That's a perfectly reasonable rule or convention of this place, and I trust that the committee will note the displeasure of the chair, and that the Minister will, hopefully through his colleagues on the Treasury bench, realise that he has been discourteous and that he will in the first instance apologise, and secondly appear before the committee as soon as possible. Thank you. Point of order, John Nicholson.
Thank you very much. Indeed, on a point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 19th of May, when responding to a question from the Honourable Member for Ealing Central and Acton, the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport claimed that the Channel 4 reality series Tower Block of Commons deceived the viewing public using actors rather than real Tower Block residents. She said, and I quote, "They were not really living in a flat. They were not real. They were actors." Indeed, she claimed that a number of the participants had confessed this to her at a subsequent dinner in the House of Commons. It's a serious charge, not least since the Secretary of State currently holds the fate of Channel 4 in her hands. Now, Channel 4 has now investigated, interviewed the production company and all the participants. The people who dined with the Secretary of State said the conversation she cited never happened, and Channel 4 has released a detailed report rebutting the Secretary of State's claim. The Select Committee Chair wrote urgently to the Secretary of State offering her the opportunity to withdraw her claim, but she's refused to do so. Now, misleading the Select Committee is obviously a serious matter, so can I ask for your guidance on what I and other members can now do, given the impending recess and the Secretary of State's possible impending flight to another place?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I first caution him to be very careful when he says in this place that an honourable member has misled anyone in the course of their duties in this House before a committee or before the Chamber. If any misleading has been done, then it will of course have been inadvertent, and I'd be grateful if he would just in the first instance acknowledge that any misleading would be inadvertent.
The Secretary of State has a reputation for extreme probity, so I'm sure that's the case.
I thank the honourable gentleman. That's probably as good as I'm going to get. The honourable gentleman will appreciate that, of course, it's not for the chair to assess whether evidence given to a committee is or is not accurate. But I understand why he wants to raise the point before the House today. And, of course, if the committee concludes that information has been given to them which is not in fact accurate, then it will be up to the committee to decide how to pursue the matter and possibly construct another evidence session. But I thank the honourable gentleman for drawing this important matter to the attention of the House. Point of order, Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the point of order, the Rother Valley Labour Party this week has been running paid-for Facebook attack adverts featuring images of my wife and my 2 children, one of whom is 7 months old and one of whom is 27 months old. Images of my young family have been also circulated online in an attack post by a Rotherham Labour councillor. Like many MPs this place, my family and I have faced death threats and threats of violence, and the circulation of images on attack posts, including by Rother Valley Labour members who I had to block previously for harassment, puts the lives of my family at further risk. I've also written to the leader of the Labour Party, the Honourable Member for St Pancras and Holborn, asking him to suspend the Labour Party members involved and formally investigate the individuals responsible for this. But what further guidance, Madam Deputy Speaker, can you offer to political parties and journalists on the unauthorised usage of pictures of MPs' young fat children and their families?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order and for having given me notice of it. This is an appalling situation. I think that regardless of political party persuasion, everyone present in the chamber will share my very serious concern about the situation that the honourable gentleman has described. I will be careful of what I say, and I urge him to be careful what he says, because of course this is really a matter of security, and we don't, of course, discuss security matters on the floor of the House. I hope that the Honourable Gentleman is in contact with the Parliamentary Security Team about it. If he would care to contact me privately, then I will make sure that the case is taken up by the Parliamentary Security Team. I cannot be too strong in making the point from the chair, and Mr. Speaker has said many times, that we all deplore any attempts to attack the families of those of us who are engaged in politics. And that is quite bad enough when those families are grown up and able to defend themselves. It is nothing less than appalling when the family concerned are very small children. The Honourable Gentleman and his family have my sympathy, but also my attention. And let us take this matter forward and make sure that the parliamentary security authorities can deal with it. Further to that point of order, Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was horrified as well to hear of the experiences of my honourable friend representing Rother Valley, but I also wanted to raise other cases of abuse, and I feel that the methods of these attack ads that are deliberately formulated to stoke up anger and contempt for members on my side of the House. I've received a death threat on the back of Labour's attack ads, as has, and he's unable to say this himself, my honourable friend, the member for Wolverhampton South West, whose children were also threatened on the back of these attack ads. These attack ads have consequences, and I would welcome your advice, because it is on us. The consequences of our actions should be on us, and I would be grateful for her advice on how we should deal with these.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her further point of order, and again I am appalled and have every sympathy with the Honourable Lady, and indeed with the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton South West, who I appreciate because of his government position cannot raise this matter on the floor of the House on his own behalf. And the Honourable Lady is speaking for both Wolverhampton members of Parliament. This is an appalling state of affairs, and once again I will say what I said to the Honourable Gentleman a few moments ago. It's a matter to be dealt with by the Parliamentary Security Team, and they will take it very seriously. And again, if either Honourable Member has not had a timely response, although I'm sure they will have, from the Parliamentary Security Team, then please come privately to me and I will take the matter up on their behalf. It is appalling that, that deliberate attacks are made upon the young families of members of Parliament. It directly undermines our democratic system and the freedom that our democracy protects. Oh, point of order, Sarah Brickcliffe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I just firstly say that I think it's absolutely disgusting what my honourable friend from Rother Valley has had to go through, and my thoughts are with his family during what must be an awful situation to be in. But sadly, I've also seen this kind of abuse from my local Labour Party in Hyndburn, and a series of events trying to undermine me, undermine my confidence, including these misleading attack ads which put your face there. So to the point where I didn't feel comfortable going back to my constituency for a period of time for fear for my safety. So especially when all I'm trying to do is represent people of Hyndburn and Hassenden. So as a young woman, I want people to come into politics, but I do worry that when they witness this constant abuse and the personal attacks on members of Parliament, it pushes them away from this. So could I seek advice as to how we improve this culture, but also call this behaviour out for what it is? Unacceptable.
Indeed, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order. The behaviour she describes is indeed unacceptable. She asks for my advice, and I will give the same advice that I've given to other honourable members within the last few minutes. The Parliamentary Security department is a most efficient and hard-working organisation. I'm constantly in touch with them on behalf of members, as is Mr. Speaker, and I meet the Director of Security very regularly and have updates on matters that affect members. We take these matters very seriously indeed, and it is simply not acceptable that the Honourable Lady feels unsafe in going to her constituency. And not only for the sake of individual members of this House and their families and friends, but as I've just said, for the protection of the very democracy for which we all work and through which we defend freedom in this country. It is very important that these matters are dealt with. So I hope that the Honourable Lady will bring the exact details to me privately, because the exact details should not be discussed across the floor of the House. Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'll start by joining the Honourable Lady from Hyndburn and saying that this is all too familiar and all too depressing, and I've had my own experience with Labour Party attack ads, but that's not what I'd like to raise in this point of order. On Monday, during the confidence debate, the Honourable Member for the Rhondda, and I have notified him and he has acknowledged the notification, specifically mentioned my sexuality and told me that I should be ashamed to be supporting this government. Now, the Chair ruled that was in order, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I accept that. However, all too predictably, the next morning my inbox was full of some of the vilest, threatening and homophobic abuse possible, specifically referencing the member for Rhondda and saying how much they supported what he'd said. Now, this isn't my first experience with senior members of the Labour Party dishing out abuse and then me having to live with the consequences. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask your guidance on how we can ensure that members are mindful of the consequences of the language they use in this chamber and the effect on other members?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his point of order. It is appalling that he has actually... we won't be having an exchange while I'm answering a point of order. Thank you. It is unacceptable and extremely concerning. The Honourable Gentleman has had death threats. That's a dreadful situation. And again, as I've just said in answer to other points of order, the Parliamentary Security Team will take this matter very seriously. I appreciate that the Honourable Gentleman is saying that the incident was sparked by something that a member on the opposition benches said about him across the floor of the House, and I was present when that happened, so I can say to the Honourable Gentleman what Mr. Speaker has said on many occasions and what other Madam Deputy Speaker said at the time. Erskine May makes it clear, and we all know that good temper and moderation are the characteristics of parliamentary debate, and all members should employ good temper and moderation at all times, no matter how strongly they feel about a particular matter that is under debate. If the Honourable Gentleman continues to have difficulties, I hope, as I've said to other Honourable Members, that he will come directly to me privately so that the Parliamentary Security Team can look at the problem. Thank you. And so we proceed to presentation of Bill. Minister.
Financial Services and Markets Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Presentation of Bill. Luke Pollard.
Firearms and Hate Crime Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 25th of November.
Friday the 25th of November. Presentation of Bill. Helen Morgan.
Bus Services Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 28th of October.
Friday the 28th of October. you. And now we come to the 10-minute rule motion on pensions extension of automatic enrolment. I call Mr. Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision about the extension of pensions automatic enrolment to job holders under the age of 22, to make provision about the lower qualified earnings threshold for automatic enrolment and for connected purposes. And can I just start, Madam Deputy Speaker, by agreeing with your comments just a few moments ago regarding my friends, the honourable members for Hindburn, Rother Valley, Wolverhampton North East, Wolverhampton South West. I think the abuse that they have been receiving recently has been unbelievable, and all of us need to be able to go about our business here in the House and in our constituencies without fear, in order to serve our constituents to the best extent that we can. In addition to those sponsoring, joint sponsoring my bill today, I'd also like to thank the members for Bishop Auckland, Workington, Darlington, Norfolk North, Sedgefield, Stockton South, Barrow Furness, Birmingham Northfields, Dover, Burnley, Hastings and Rye, Grantham and Stamford and Clwyd South, who have also indicated to me their support for the legislation, and that's alongside many other members who have also indicated to me privately that they are very supportive of this legislation. The legislation addresses two sections of the 2008 Act, namely Section 3 and 5, which would lower the age of auto-enrolment to 18, and Section 13, which would lower the earnings limit. And crucially, Madam Deputy Speaker, what it does is it allows the Secretary of State to change these regulations. We're not proposing to, this legislation does not bring in those changes now and automatically, but what it does is it puts it in the hands of the Secretary of State, in accordance with our manifesto, to bring those changes forwards in due course, when the government feels that the time is right for that to happen. And I would like particularly to thank the Pensions Minister, my friend, the Honourable Member for Hexham, who has been so supportive throughout the entire process of looking into this in my private member's bill, the 10-minute rule bill in the last session, and indeed in my bill in this session. So I'd like to thank him very greatly personally. And I'm also very grateful to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who I spoke to earlier today in a brief meeting, and I look forward to having further fruitful discussions with him in the not too distant future. The crucial thing about this legislation is that it's there to drive forwards a major change in policy. And it's worth a huge additional amount of money when you roll it in over a long period of time for people who are in lower paid work and younger workers, people who start work at age 18, up to over trillions of pounds over a 50-year working lifetime of the current labour force. A policy introduced in our Conservative manifesto, recommitted to since the 2019 general election at the dispatch box. The expansion of auto-enrolment is about helping to entrench ambition for people and their futures, and to protect them in retirement. The ambition of people to look after themselves, look after their families, and also provide more for their communities, for the very towns and villages that they live in. From North West Durham, this means from Consett to Crook, from Lanehead to Langley Park. It means a transformation, as we've seen with auto-enrolment over the past few years, but an extension of that transformation as big as the share ownership changes of the 1980s and right to buy was under the Conservative administration then, enabling people to look after themselves and provide for their families in the future. At the moment, 3/4 of those aged over the age of 22 are automatically enrolled into a pension scheme, and for every 50 pence, £1 is saved. Yet under the age of 22, that's only 20%. This is a massive difference, and will make a massive difference to the lives of those young workers. For part-time workers, auto-enrolment stands at under 60%, compared to over 90% of workers in full-time jobs. If we assume a move from 22 to 18 will bring about a similar take-up, this bill will see an extra roughly third of the part-time workforce auto-enrolled, an increase of 50% from the present numbers. This would mean millions of people, mostly women, those from minority communities and those who are socially disadvantaged, being brought into lifetime savings for their futures. These are the lives of the people this bill seeks to make a difference to. Analysis by Onward, a think tank, shows exactly where these people tend to be located. They're in places like North West Durham, places like Workington in Cumbria, Hindman in Lancashire, Mansfield in Nottinghamshire. They're the parts of the Red Wall that this party won at the last general election. as well as from large parts of the South West, Midlands, Scotland, North Wales and the North East. They're from areas of the country which are seeking that broad transformative change that this party is seeking to deliver in government. Let me give a couple of examples. First of all, a full-time worker on the national living wage would gain almost an extra £100,000 by that increase over their lifetime, a 60% increase on today. And that's not money which goes out all in one block. It's small savings over time, after it's been introduced, after the next general election. It's about incremental change to make real differences to people's lives. And for younger workers, the average person working full-time on a living wage between 18 and 22 would pay in just a few £100 a year, literally a few pounds a week. But that difference, with 50 years of compound interest, could see £25,000 to £30,000 added to the pension pot at the end of their life. That is a huge, huge difference. £1,000 paid in over 3 years could increase £25,000 to £30,000 at the end of their life because of compound interest. This is the one that really astounds me, though. People earning around £9,000 from 2 separate jobs. At the moment, maybe working 12, 18 hours a week, juggling around childcare or caring responsibilities. They don't get the benefits at the moment of auto-enrolment at all. Under this legislation, somebody in that position would see their pension savings almost tripled to up to £300,000 over a lifetime. That might be somebody who can give a deposit to their children, really help themselves out in retirement, giving them that comfort and perhaps to look after younger members of the family in later life, and give them security in retirement and old age, not reliant on the state, but self-reliant. These are the people who these are the people in my constituency. These are real examples from people that I've met. And these are the sort of people that this party should be doing everything it can to help long-term savings of into the future. The government's programme of expansion of auto-enrolment has been fantastic. It's not hyperbolic to say that this is one of the best changes we've seen in this country over the last 10 years. But now, with all that evidence of the huge positive impact that this can have, it is a no-brainer to say we need to extend auto-enrolment to those 18 years plus. It's absolutely outrageous that at the moment the legislation says to graduates, as soon as you graduate, you'll be auto-enrolled. But to my kids, the 70% of whom leave school aged 18 and go into work, that you aren't auto-enrolled until you're 22 years old. I think it's a scandal, and it's something that we need to deal with. And also those young people, the more they save and the sooner they save, the more they get into a routine of it, the more they're providing for themselves and providing for their security in retirement. This is a serious piece of legislation that could make serious change. It's about bringing people security in their old age at minimal cost to them when they're younger. It's about engineering a revolution for working-class people undertaking, amongst other things, apprenticeships. These changes were actually initially thought of back in the late 70s, and then again talked about in the late 1990s. But it's only now that that this is being really pushed for through this private members' bill, a real expansion to everybody, so everybody has their own pension in addition to their state pension in retirement and can have that comfort in old age. We must table legislation now so that businesses can prepare for the future. There is no better way, particularly to help low-paid workers in constituencies like mine, people who've gone through the pandemic, gone through sometimes in very great difficulty in the retail sector, in the care sector. These are the ones who will directly benefit from this legislation. And we must be clear here. This policy will have no fiscal impact before the next general election. It will just create the primary legislation necessary for the implementation of this bill without tying their hands to a specific timing for future ministers. It leaves the details of that secondary legislation for the future government to stipulate and ultimately implement. The aim of this is to not tie anyone's hands, but to get legislation ready to go. It's to give a signal to business and a signal to society, to working people, that we're on their side. This legislation will transform the lives of millions of working people. Not in great jobs, often, but in low-paid work, the backbone of our country. Votes that were lent to us at the last general election, and we have to deliver on. Alongside changes like Solvency II, this could also help put cash into communities like North West Durham to help provide that extra private sector money to deliver the levelling up we need, because it can't all be through government and taxpayers' cash. It's about how you deliver long-term investment outside of metropolitan London. We need to think creatively and constructively how we do that, Madam Deputy Speaker. To me, this seems the clearest, easiest ways to do it, in a way in which also benefits the working people of this country. And I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As members that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Robbie Moore, Sean Bailey, Nicola Richards, Miriam Cates, Simon Jupp, Mark Eastwood, Anthony Brown, Aaron Bell, Jonathan Gullis, Sir Gavin Williamson and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Richard Holden.
Yeah.
Pensions. Extension of automatic enrolment bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 28th of October.
Friday the 28th of October. Thank you. We now come to the point of order, Mr. Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. You will realise that there was a point of order a little while ago from the Honourable Member for Haywood and Middleton. Now, he said that he had notified me in advance of the point of order, in which he named me, as you know. In actual fact, he sent me an email at 2:20, in which he said, I wanted to make you aware that I intend to name you in the chamber today. He didn't say when he perfectly well knew he was going to do it in about 5 minutes' time. I replied, when and in what context? I don't think that is a proper notification. He replied, the consequences of intemperate language in the chamber. Perfectly fair for him to raise a point of order, but he hadn't given me proper notice. I think you would agree that that is not proper notice. If he'd given me proper notice, I would have made sure I was in the chamber to be able to answer it, because that's for the convenience of the House. And the second point is, he said that I'd referred to his sexuality in the debate. I would never, ever do so, nor did I do so. As Hansard records, I did not do so. This is simply untrue. I very much hope the Honourable Member will withdraw the allegation that he's made. I certainly do think that there are problems about the way the government has created a hostile environment for LGBT people in this country. I am simply citing the Equalities Minister, who said so himself when he resigned. The government Equalities Minister, who said so when he resigned. That was the only point I was making. I, of course, wholly abhor and hate the idea that anybody, as a result of anything I might say, either in this chamber or anywhere else, might have death threats addressed towards them. I've had plenty myself, and I've had the police at my house this week myself. So I wholly deplore that. And if there is any sense in which he has felt antagonised and that this has been brought on by anything I've said, I apologise. But I would say, I didn't say what he said. I simply quoted the Conservative government Minister for Equality when he resigned, who said that he was resigning because the government was creating a hostile environment for LGBT people in this country.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order, and I have to separate out from what the honourable gentleman said that which is a point of order for the chair and that which is an expression of a political opinion. The honourable gentleman is entitled to his political opinion, and I, of course, will make no comment on it whatsoever. If the honourable gentleman for Haywood and Middleton has not properly given notice to the honourable gentleman that he intended to mention him here in the chamber, then that is quite simply wrong. I can't, from the information that is available to me now, ascertain whether due notice was given or not, but I will discuss the matter with Mr. Speaker and consider the evidence. The honourable gentleman also makes reference to what was actually said here in the chamber on Monday evening, I was still in the chamber at the moment of the exchange, having just left the chair, and it would be an understatement to say that tempers were running high on all sides that evening, and that, as I mentioned a few moments ago, good temper and moderation ought to be the characteristics of parliamentary debate. I'm not satisfied that either good temper or moderation were present at that point in the debate on Monday evening, and I do sincerely hope that however strongly members feel about a particular issue which they're addressing, that we can approach most matters in a calm fashion, which will allow us to debate the facts rather than the emotions, though I'm not negating the place of emotions in some debates. I hope that the honourable gentleman will leave it with me to look further into this matter. Thank you. We now come to the programme motion. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill Programme number 2 motion as on the order paper. Minister has moved. The question is the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill Programme number 2 motion as on the order paper. As that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, Committee.
Now.
We now move to Committee of the whole House. Order.
Do you have your cushion?
I would like a cushion.
Can you pass and say you need a cushion for the chair?
Order.
Northern Ireland Protocol Bill.
We will begin with Amendment 38 to Clause 13, with which it will be convenient to consider the amendments, clauses and new clauses as listed on the selection paper. I call Stephen Doughty to move Amendment 38.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair today as we move into the third day of this committee on the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. And I beg to move Amendment 38 in the name of myself and my honourable and right honourable friends. And as we enter the third day of debate on this bill, what it shows is that instead of working to fix the challenges, the genuine challenges that the protocol poses, the government continue to push forward with a bill that disregards the UK's international legal obligations and threatens to throw Britain's global reputation into disrepute, and which also, and we'll be discussing this today, Madam Deputy Speaker, which gives them sweeping powers without restriction. Tearing up binding agreements, threatening to break international law and walking away from the table are not the composites of a good negotiating strategy. They are the hallmarks of a zombie government out of steam, and one which has consistently put their own party squabbles and obsessions before the interests of the United Kingdom and indeed of the people of Northern Ireland. And tragically, they also risk dividing the UK and the European Union when we should be standing shoulder to shoulder in opposing Putin's barbaric war in Ukraine, and indeed in finding ways to make Brexit work in a spirit of trust and cooperation. That's not how a responsible government should behave, and many members across the House know that. What we need, Madam Chair, is cool heads, statesmanlike behaviour and a search for long-term solutions. And on these benches we feel that the bill is counterproductive, but that solutions are there if the government are prepared to seek them. And that requires compromise, hard work and flexibility on all sides, including, of course, the EU, not knee-jerk reactions. And indeed, I've listened to the very many genuine concerns that have been raised about the functioning of the protocol. I have the pleasure, Madam Chair, of being a member of the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly in addition to my shadow frontbench role. And I've listened to businesses, I've been in Dublin and Belfast, I've listened to people on all sides and I've heard genuine concerns, including those of the unionist community. community. But for months, Labour has called on the government to do the responsible thing, get back around the table, to do what we've always done and what any government worth its salt would do, which is to negotiate in the interest of finding workable, practical and technocratic solutions which command the consent and support of all communities in Northern Ireland and have the means to bring back power sharing in a meaningful and lasting way. And in that spirit, Madam Chair, we've offered amendments to Bill today in good faith to begin to correct the issues which are manifest across this legislation. Those start today with the Henry VIII clauses, which we've heard about so far, and which the amendments that we've tabled in this section address. Now, as my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, set out during the second reading, 15 of the 26 clauses included in this bill confer powers directly onto UK ministers, and that includes the power to use secondary legislation to amend or modify Acts of Parliament, acts which have been subject to the full scrutiny of this House. But as the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law sets out, the Henry VIII powers given to ministers in this bill, and I quote, are numerous, extensive and subject to very low hurdles before those powers may be exercised. Indeed, Professor Catherine Barnard of Cambridge University has called these powers eye-wateringly broad. The Hansard Society, deeply respected on all sides of this House, describes them as breathtaking. And Madam Chair, we shouldn't just take their word for it. The chair of the Justice Select Committee last week put it perfectly when he said that there are Henry VIII powers and there are Henry VIII powers, and this is Henry VIII, the six wives, Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell, all thrown in together. He went on to describe the Henry VIII powers as almost, and I quote, Shakespearean or Wagnerian in their scope and breadth. Awarding ministers these enormous powers is not a strategy, and the people of Northern Ireland will see it for what it is, a blatant power grab. The member for Bromley and Chislehurst, the chair of the Select Committee, identified one of the key problems with these powers, because he explained that the test that ministers meet before using these powers is, and I quote, extraordinarily low. And I agree with him, Madam Chair. As the bill currently stands, in many cases, ministers may use these powers merely if they consider it appropriate to do so. That is simply not good enough. Not is only this a woefully low threshold, it also lacks any kind of objectivity. We cannot, Madam Chair, simply have a situation where ministers can make sweeping changes which are not necessarily in the interest of all communities of Northern Ireland and without proper scrutiny and process. And we on this side of the House are indeed extremely concerned, Madam Chair, as to what ministers may deem appropriate in the future.
Will my honourable friend give way on that?
I will happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making an excellent speech. Just one point to add to this is, does he agree with me that there's a certain irony in the fact that probably large numbers of the 52% who voted for Brexit voted to strengthen and solidify and consolidate parliamentary sovereignty. But these Henry VIII powers are strengthening the hand of government and weakening the hand of Parliament. Doesn't that seem to run directly counter to what many people who voted for Brexit were voting for?
Well, I would completely agree with my honourable friend. Indeed, it takes powers away not only from this place, but of course it is also taking on powers without the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. I will happily give way.
Further to that point, Dame Eleanor, I don't understand why the official opposition don't get it. That there is a democratic deficit as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol. The honourable member bemoans the fact that Parliament might lose some powers to the government. But in Northern Ireland, we today are faced with the imposition of regulations, hundreds and hundreds of them, over which neither Parliament or the government has any say, nor the Northern Ireland Assembly or Executive, and yet I hear nothing from the opposition benches about that democratic deficit, and at least the government is attempting to address it. What does the official opposition intend to do about it?
Well, I'll just respond to that point first. I always listen with great respect to what the right honourable gentleman says. He talks about democratic deficit. Of course, it was the government across the way who negotiated the protocol. He has been consistent in his criticisms of it. The government knew that when they negotiated it. They knew that there were issues that needed to be addressed. But of course, it seems to me very, very odd that what the government is proposing to do here is take huge amounts of powers that would have no scrutiny in this place and would have no scrutiny in Northern Ireland. I'll happily give way.
I'm just going to point out, I thank the member for giving way, that we hear a lot about the egregious use of powers and regulations being imposed. We hear very little about what specific powers people don't want to have. I think it's about the volume of lawnmowers and such crucial things like that. But does he agree with me that in fact it's more damaging to democracy that the Northern Ireland Assembly, in which elected members are supposed to address wider issues around health, education, the economy and everyday issues for Northern Ireland, that being withheld creates a far wider democratic deficit?
Well, indeed, the point I've made is that, of course, that these powers that the government's taking take away responsibilities from the Northern Ireland Assembly, and indeed we want to see all communities having a say on matters that are going to affect them going forward, and I'm sure we're going to come on to a number of those amendments in due course. But, Madam Chair, in the same vein, we would support the amendment number 12 that's been tabled in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, which relates to clause 18, were he to push that to a vote. As the Hansard Society has pointed out, clause 18 would give ministers the power to, and I quote, engage in conduct relevant to the Northern Ireland Protocol if they consider it, and again this word, appropriate in connection with one or more of the purposes of the bill. But of course the bill gives no elaboration on to what type of activities this conduct could involve, nor has the government given a justification for why this additional power is needed. And indeed the former head of the Government Legal Service, Sir Jonathan Jones QC, someone who has said a lot about the legality of this bill, described this, and I quote again, Madam Chair, as a do whatever you like it power. Given the government can provide no assurances on what types of conduct this power will be restricted to, and we have no justification as to why the power is even needed, this is not something we can support, and that's why we would support the amendment that my honourable friend has put down. The government is in no position to expand its powers to such a degree, particularly in areas so sensitive. Not only are they a gross overreach of power, but they are also disrespectful to the constitutional role of this House. Madam Chair, I want to turn to some of the other amendments that are tabled. Labour have been clear since the bill was first introduced the way to solve the problems before us is to negotiate and negotiate in good faith, and we recognise that the operation of the protocol has created genuine tensions which need to be addressed, but that is best done by all sides listening to each other and acting in good faith, with the Good Friday Belfast Agreement at the heart of those discussions. But I would contend that this bill simply does not do that. It's not an act of good faith for Westminster to unilaterally impose a solution, not least across Northern Ireland, and nor, tragically, will this solution proposed achieve its ultimate objectives. Only an agreement which delivers for the people and businesses of Northern Ireland and respects the wishes of those on all sides and all communities will provide a long-term and sustainable solution to this problem. And that's why we would support the Amendment 49, which has been tabled, which references the fourth point in the protocol and the importance of protecting the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement in all of its parts, if that were to be pushed to a vote. Unilateralism is not the way forward on matters of such sensitivity. Madam Chair, I don't want to detain the committee further at this stage of the bill. We've got many amendments to get through today. But to conclude, the amendments that we've put down today would prevent the government taking on overreaching powers that it's simply not fit to hold. And they would protect the much valued scrutinising and functioning of this House and indeed give a voice in this hugely delicate and important process to the people of Northern Ireland. I'll conclude at this stage, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 38 be made. Minister Michael Ellis.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dame Eleanor, and allow me for, I think, the penultimate time to thank honourable members who have spoken in previous committee stage sessions. I'd like to turn to the clauses under discussion for this debate, and I, with the leave of the House, will deal with some of the amendments very briefly indeed. But just to go through the clauses for this session, Clause 13 outlines the exclusions that seek to redress the feeling that there is a democratic deficit created by the arrangements for the implementation and enforcement of the protocol. The present role, Dame Eleanor, of the Court of Justice of the European Union, the CJEU, clearly causes unionists to feel less connected to and part of the United Kingdom, and this was reflected in the September 21 joint statement by all unionist parties on the protocol. So what Clause 13 does is it provides that any provision of the protocol which confers jurisdiction on the CJEU over arrangements in Northern Ireland is excluded provision, and this means that the CJEU decisions, including infractions, will no longer have effect in domestic law across the entire protocol. Now, I would like to confirm to the House that the bill does not disapply the withdrawal agreement's arbitration process, which would be convened at the international level in the event of a dispute. It simply affirms that the arbitration provisions in the withdrawal agreement don't have effect in our domestic law, and that is normal for international treaties. It then helps to restore the UK government's sole oversight of arrangements on the ground in Northern Ireland, providing that the provisions relating to the powers and presence of EU representatives are excluded. And finally, via subsections 4 and 5, what that clause does is it allows for the establishment of new arrangements for cooperation with EU authorities to monitor the trade boundary regime, and it will enable us to implement robust data sharing on the operation of the Trusted Trader Scheme and on all goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And this will support assurance processes to uphold our commitment to protect both the UK internal market and the EU's single market. And Dame Eleanor, then clause 14 supports the coherent functioning of the bill by fully insulating any excluded provision from being brought back into our domestic law as a result of obligations arising from other provisions of the Protocol and Withdrawal Agreement. If needs be, regulations under subsection 4 can be used to make appropriate provision in connection with any provision of the Protocol or Withdrawal Agreement to which this clause relates. The clause provides important clarity on the interaction between excluded provision and any wider provisions in the Protocol or Withdrawal Agreement related to it. Clause 18, Dame Eleanor, provides a power for a minister to engage in non-legislative conduct where they consider it appropriate in connection with one or more of the purposes in the bill. And this clause also clarifies the relationship between powers to make secondary legislation under this bill and those arising by virtue of the royal prerogative. This clause will ensure that actions not requiring legislation, such as issuing guidance to industry or providing direction to officials, can be taken in a timely manner by a Minister of the Crown. It is not, as I think has been misconstrued in some quarters, an extraordinary power. It simply makes clear, as would normally be taken for granted, that ministers will be acting lawfully when they go about their ministerial duties in support of this legislation. And clause 20, Dame Eleanor, allows for the proper functioning of domestic court proceedings following the removal of the domestic effect of CJEU jurisdiction. What this means is that domestic courts would no longer be bound by CJEU principles or decisions when considering matters relating to the protocol. The clause provides a power to make related new provision, and regulations made under this power could, for example, provide for a procedure to refer questions of interpretation of EU law to the CJEU, if a domestic court considered it necessary to conclude its proceedings. And I would, in a moment, if I may, this clause is important to the functioning of the bill to allow domestic courts to consider proceedings relating to the protocol without being subject to CJEU jurisdiction, in line with the general principles of the bill. And if the honourable member wouldn't mind, I'll give way to him when I come to his amendment specifically. I'd be very grateful if he'd give me that indulgence. And I want to move now, Dame Eleanor, to the amendments in order, and some of them I think, with the leave of the House, I can deal with very briefly. With regard to amendments 38, 39, 42 and 43, these are from, in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Tottenham, and I think also the name of the Right Honourable Member for Cardiff South and Penarth. They would, as has previously been explained regarding similar amendments, in our view, wrongly apply a necessity test for the use of powers like these. Parliament has previously determined, for example, in the EU Withdrawal Bill Act of 2018, that appropriateness is the appropriate word. And so that is what I would say as regards that particular series of amendments. With regards to Amendment 12, in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central, the amendment that has been laid by that Right Honourable Member would remove the power for ministers to engage in conduct in relation to the protocol, which is normally within the executive's competence, but not otherwise authorised by the bill. Now, Dame Eleanor, as I explained to the House a short while ago, this clause simply makes clear that, as would normally be taken for granted, ministers of the Crown would be acting lawfully when they go about their ministerial duties. For example, providing instruction to civil servants or guidance to industry in support of this legislation. It is not an extraordinary power, but rather it provides certainty that the government can implement our proposals. So I would urge the right honourable gentleman to withdraw his amendment there. With regards to Amendment 48, this is an amendment from the honourable member for Foyle. The view of Her Majesty's Government as regards this matter is, this amendment is that it would be unworkable. It would require the Assembly, which is not sitting, of course, and that's part of the whole essence of this bill, to pass a prohibitive number of votes to enable swift implementation of the solutions delivered by the bill. So I would ask him to withdraw his amendment. Then moving on to Amendment 49, this is from the honourable member for Foyle. Dame Eleanor, the amendment here would require ministers to have due regard for the principle that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement should be protected in all its parts. The honourable member states that this amendment is based on the fourth point in the preamble to the protocol, which sets out the United Kingdom and the European Union's affirmation of their commitment to do just that. The government's overriding commitment, and I emphasise this as strongly as I can, is to protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in all its dimensions. That commitment is absolute, but the balance within that agreement, and which was critical to its negotiation, must be maintained. And it is for that very reason that the government has introduced this bill, as I've said. So I welcome and I endorse the sentiment underlying this particular amendment. However, for the same reason, the amendment is unnecessary, and so I would urge the honourable member to withdraw it. With regards to Amendment 46, this is an amendment from the honourable member for North Down, and would require the Assembly to approve Clause 20. This, in the government's view, is inappropriate under the devolution settlements because it would prevent the bill from making important changes that go to the heart of the current democratic deficit. I don't know, does the honourable gentleman wish to give way now?
I'm very grateful to the Minister giving way. And I assure him this is only a probing amendment for this particular group. I won't be putting that one to a vote. But could I ask him, in terms of the government's position of removing the ultimate jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, does the government recognise that in doing so, they would in effect unpick Northern Ireland's access to the single market for goods, in that we would not be fully in line with the required EU law for that to take effect?
No, I don't accept the characterisation he puts on this. This is something that is very important to the whole community in Northern Ireland, and it is very important that we have a cross-community consensus in the working of these operations. So I don't accept the premise of... Yes, and I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
In fact, this bill makes all of the provision necessary for firms in Northern Ireland which wish to access the single market being able to do so by opting for dual regulation. And if they've opted for dual regulation, then surely that's what gives them access to the single market, not an oversight by the European Court of Justice.
Well, the honourable gentleman is certainly right about the dual regulatory regime. Of course, we discussed at some length, this committee discussed at some length yesterday, and I would agree with his contention there. I will.
Could the member please clarify for me? I'm struggling to understand. The member repeatedly refers to the need for cross-community consent. Does he understand, and has he noted the letter from a majority of MLAs, including all of the
majority again?
No unions. Does he acknowledge that all MLAs representing others and representing nationalists reject this bill in the strongest possible terms? And can he outline how these recommendations and these powers have cross-community consent if they are rejected by 2/3 of the three traditions in Northern Ireland?
Majority rule.
Well, as I think the Honourable Lady knows, this can't be about majoritarianism. I think the Honourable Lady knows that. But the fact of the matter is, though, that we have what we do have. I mean, I do note a poll from December, by the way, December of 2021, which indicated 78% agreed in Northern Ireland that the protocol needed change. But what I would say to the Honourable Lady that the requirements are that there is cross-community consensus. And I think I've made the position.
Order.
She's shouting from us.
Order! The Honourable Lady knows she can't shout like that while she's sitting down. If she wishes to intervene again, she can try to intervene. I will not have this shouting. Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Dame Eleanor. I would simply reiterate to the Honourable Lady and to the whole House and Committee that our overriding priority is preserving peace and stability in Northern Ireland, and I make no apology for repeating it. You know, the situation as it stands, Dame Eleanor, is undermining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and it's undermining power sharing. I mean, that's proven by the very fact that we don't have an operating Northern Ireland Assembly. I mean, surely that's proof positive. I'll give way.
And does he share my bafflement at the intervention which he has just had to respond to? On one hand, there is an amendment, Amendment 49, which he was referring to, in the name of the SDLP, requiring the government to ensure that the principle that the Belfast Agreement, including all of its implementation, should be protected in all parts. And yet, at the same time, we're being told that since a majority in the Assembly, which doesn't include one unionist, which was a key principle of the Belfast Agreement, should override any of the views which are being expressed by unionists in these benches today.
Well, I think he makes his point with his usual eloquence, and of course the citation that he makes from the agreement is irrefutable. I mean, it is simply on the face of the document, and I'll give way.
Well, very grateful for the Minister for giving way. Could he just point out the page, paragraph, line of the Good Friday Agreement that he's quoting? Because this doesn't make any sense.
I think he's very familiar with the agreement in question, and of course he won't need me to cite the passages in question. He's very familiar with the document. I think he's being mischievous, but in the best possible sense of that word. But what I think we do know, Dame Eleanor, is that the most important thing, and I'm sure all sides would agree, is the preservation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That surely is irrefutable. Now, I'll move on to Amendment 13, if I may, and that is from the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central. This amendment would bind domestic courts into the existing CJEU reference procedure without any choice as to what the new arrangements are. That, in my view and the government's view, would not resolve the current democratic deficit. So, Dame Eleanor, that is the position as far as the amendments are concerned. What I would say is that in the circumstances that I have outlined, I hope in sufficient detail, that is the position of Her Majesty's Government, and I would therefore recommend that these clauses all stand part of the bill.
Thank you. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Dame Eleanor, and I'm happy to follow the Minister. And reference has been made to the oversight of the European Court of Justice. And whilst our primary concern in relation to the protocol is in respect of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we do have a concern about the role of the European Court of Justice in respect of oversight where there is a dispute between the United Kingdom and the European Union in relation to matters pertaining to the protocol. We believe it is unfair and unreasonable that the European Court of Justice should be the final arbiter on such matters. Of course.
Would my honourable friend accept that in no other agreement, trade agreement, would one side be able to be the side which made the adjudication as to whether or not the terms were being accepted? Yet in this particular case, the EU, who has got skin in the game, would be the final arbiter on any dispute that there is, which is totally unfair. totally unwarranted and totally unprecedented.
Well, and indeed, Dame Eleanor, it also speaks to the issue I raised in my earlier intervention about the democratic deficit. And what the government is endeavouring to do with this bill is to correct those flaws that were evident from the protocol itself. And whilst some here in the House will point to the fact that the government signed up to the protocol, I welcome the fact that the government recognises that the protocol is not working, that it is harmful to Northern Ireland, and that changes need to be made. And that is very important. So the democratic deficit is something that we believe needs to be addressed. So far, the European Union has shown an unwillingness to bring forward proposals that would meet the concerns of the United Kingdom in this regard. Whether there will be a change of heart on that, we do not yet know. But in the absence of such a change of heart, we are with the government on this, that we want a system that is fair and reasonable. And I repeat, Dame Eleanor, what I have said throughout this committee stage, that if we set aside the process of how we got here and look at and examine the detail of what the government is proposing as a framework to provide solutions to these problems, I believe that framework is fair. It respects the integrity of the EU single market and their right to protect that market, but it fundamentally, for us, also recognises and respects the right of the United Kingdom to protect the integrity of its internal market, to regulate its own internal market. And the protocol prevents the government from doing that for the whole of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland currently is the subject, as I explained, to regulations that are introduced by the European Union in a manner over which we have no say. Now, other members have raised the fact that at the moment we do not have a fully functioning Assembly and Executive in Northern Ireland. And yet, I still do not see or hear from them an understanding of how that situation has arisen. It was with great reluctance that we took the decision to withdraw the First Minister back in February, and it was only after much delay, Dame Eleanor, and I stood on the green outside this building and was mocked by the Honourable Member for Foyle for not having followed through on the warning I had given to withdraw the First Minister. And he goaded us that we had not followed through. And now he sits on these benches and attacks us for taking the very decision we warned we would have to take, Dame Eleanor, if progress was not made towards addressing the issues related to the protocol. And I have also said, and in the course of these debates have reiterated, that as we make progress, as decisive action is taken by the government in the form of this implementing this legislation, then of course we will restore those political institutions, because we want them to work and we want them to function in the way they were intended to function. And the Honourable Member for Foyle and the Honourable Member for South Belfast seem to be suggesting from a sedentary position earlier that the concept of power sharing and consensus was not a fundamental principle of the Belfast Agreement. Well, I have to differ from them on that. I believe that power sharing is at the heart of the Belfast Agreement, that the principle that in a divided society like Northern Ireland, you cannot have one side, as it were, having all the power, and others excluded from power. And therefore, the concept of power sharing was embraced by the political parties in Northern Ireland, and has been the basis upon which those political institutions have operated. But for power sharing to work requires consensus. It requires cross-community consensus. And this new language I hear from the SDLP in particular, but also, I have to say, from the Alliance Party as well, constantly talking about a majority of this and a majority of that, But majority rule, we were told when unionists had the majority, was anathema to the Alliance Party. It was anathema to the SDLP. You could not have a unionist majority governing in Northern Ireland. It had to be cross-community consensus. And yet, when unionists are the people with the concerns, when unionists are the people who have the issues, when unionists are saying that the consensus, the cross-community consensus, does not exist, our concerns are almost dismissed, and there is lip service paid to them, but at every opportunity, opposition is brought forward to reasonable change that would address the concerns of unionists. And what I have not heard from the likes of the SDLP is what the solution is beyond let's have negotiations with the EU. But negotiations have been tried.
300 hours. 300
hours of negotiations. And look, if the EU are prepared to come back to the table, change their negotiating mandate, and act in good faith to get a solution that restores the cross-community consensus in Northern Ireland, bravo. But we see no inclination from the European Union that they're going to do that. So what do? Do we just sit back, rub our hands and say it's all too difficult, and wait for the day when hopefully the EU will come riding over the hill and rescue the political stability in Northern Ireland, rescue the Belfast Agreement, rescue the concept of power sharing on the basis of a cross-community consensus? Well, it hasn't happened, despite the bold claims by the European Union that the protocol was designed to protect the Good Friday Agreement, to protect the political institutions. But that hasn't happened. Those institutions are not functioning precisely because there is not a cross-community consensus in support of the protocol, and what we need are arrangements that restore Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market, which respects the outcome of Article 1 of the agreement, that Northern Ireland remains an integral part of the United Kingdom. That was recognised by the Irish government, by the people of the Republic of Ireland who voted in a referendum to change their constitution to recognise that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And I'm afraid the protocol has disrespected that constitutional settlement, that recognition that for the time being that is the settled will of the people of Northern Ireland. So these issues are fundamentally important, Dame Eleanor, and addressing the democratic deficit is important.
Will you give way?
I will give way to the honourable member for 4.
Despite what he's been saying, I'm very grateful for the right honourable member for giving way. Look, I know he's a newcomer to supporting the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, he left the talks before they were concluded and then opposed the Good Friday Agreement from the outset. That's fine, that is his right. But does he agree with me that I think, I wonder, can he explain to me what version of Brexit can get this mythical cross-community consensus, because that is the word consensus in terms of that is not in the Good Friday Agreement.
Across the UK.
Well, Dame Eleanor, I'm not going to delve back into the history of Northern Ireland. I'm not going to leave the House bemused by an exchange on this side about the wherefores and the merits of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Yes, I did vote against the agreement in 1998 because I was opposed to what I regarded as deep flaws in that agreement, not least the abject failure of the agreement to address the needs of the innocent victims of the Troubles. Their needs were trampled over in the initial format of the agreement, and we're now dealing, almost 25 years later, we're now trying to deal with the legacy. But the legacy is not just the legacy of the 30 years of violence, it's the legacy of 25 years of where an agreement failed to address this issue in the first instance, and I happen to believe that's an important part that ought to have been dealt with in 1998, was not dealt with in 1998, and I voted against the agreement on that basis. But to be clear, at no stage did I ever oppose the agreement on the basis that I opposed power sharing, never, nor that I believed that the only way forward was anything other than a cross-community consensus. I have argued consistently as a unionist that in a divided society cross-community consensus has to be the way forward. And so if I'm a relatively recent convert to the agreement, and my conversion, if it be that, was at St Andrews, when we got the changes that we needed to the agreement so that those flaws could be addressed in a proper way. But I have to say, I'd rather have experienced that than be pedalling in the opposite direction, which is to say that we're moving towards majority rule. We're moving towards a situation where those unionists should get back in the corner. They may have their concerns, but we don't want to hear about them. Yes, nationalist concerns do need to be heard, and I believe the proposals the government have made address the concerns on both sides of the community. They address the need to protect the integrity of the European Union and the need to protect the integrity of the United Kingdom. And you know what? In 1998, when the referendum was held on the Good Friday Agreement, and I voted against it, the day the referendum result was announced, I stood outside at Balmoral in South Belfast in the constituency of the Honourable Member and declared that I accepted the referendum result. I would continue to work to change the agreement in a way that would benefit all the people of Northern Ireland. And I would love to hear from the bench behind me someday the SDLP finally accepting the result of the largest democratic vote ever held in this United Kingdom, where the people of this nation voted to leave the European Union. And if you don't like what has happened, you work to change the arrangements, which is what we are trying to do, rather than to go back to 2016 and say it's all too difficult, it's all terrible, and therefore we can't do anything about it. The essence of democracy and the essence of good politics is that when you don't like something, you seek to change it. I give way.
Does he understand why nationalists